Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you might as well listen to this story, and maybe you will fall asleep soon. Before listening, please like and subscribe first. Of course, the premise is that you really like my content. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave a message below. Your opinions will really help me grow. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's get started. That night, the wind blew the fallen petals of the jacaranda trees into my face as I squatted beside a pit in a cemetery being renovated on the outskirts of Melbourne, my gloves almost soaked with mud. When a shovel of soil was raised, a shiny silver object rolled to my feet. It's a cufflink. The surface was mottled with rust, but the bloodstains were clearly visible. At least 20 years old. Can DNA be preserved? I looked up and asked the forensic Dr. Roger. He picked up the cufflink and frowned as he stared at it for a long while. If it had come into contact with the wound back then, it's possible. None of us spoke and the atmosphere seemed frozen. This cufflink was dug out from next to Rebecca Carter's remains. Her case has been dormant for 20 years. The next morning, I was transferred to be the person in charge of the reopened investigation of the Jacaranda Girl murder case. The superior didn't explain much, just pushed the document in front of me and said, "Your teacher did it back then, and now we have to ask him to come back and help." I can't describe how I feel. Arthur Hawke, the mentor I once respected most. 10 years ago, before he retired, he personally brought me into the Serious Crime Squad. He said I had a pair of eyes that never lie, but I always knew he never really got over that case. The guard at the nursing home remembered me and let me in without asking any questions. Arthur lives in a single room at the end of the second floor. On the windowsill is a photo of him when he was young. He is wearing a neat uniform, with the Melbourne police station in 2003 behind him. His hair is now thinning and grey, and his eyes are a little unfocused. "Claire," he saw me and smiled. "You're back too." I nodded and put the file bag on the table. We dug up a cufflink in the cemetery. There was DNA residue on it. He was stunned for a moment, then slowly sat down, as if something had hit his spine. "Rebecca, she was wearing a blue shirt, wasn't she?" I remember it very clearly. She had jacaranda petals in her hair that night. I stared at him. "Do you remember any more details? Like who might have been with her?" He was silent for a few seconds, and suddenly whispered, "Sean." He told me that he pushed her. My heart sank. Sean was his son, who was only 17 years old at the time. Rebecca's secret boyfriend. I looked at Arthur's face. There was no regret on it, but pain, fear, and a mixture of some kind of struggle. That expression doesn't sound like an old policeman who only remembers the results of the case, but more like a person who is desperately trying to cover up the truth. He suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Do you believe me, Claire?" "I can't answer that." In the afternoon we went to the evidence room, and those dusty files were laid out before us one by one. Rebecca's diary, photos from the scene, fingerprint reports, and the dress she was last wearing. When I picked up the silver cufflink, my eyes suddenly went blank. It's like someone hit the rewind button. I saw a hand, pale, slender, and wearing a ring, fastening this cufflink to the cuff of a dark shirt. That hand is the left hand. I woke up suddenly, breathing rapidly, and cold sweat soaked my back.
No one noticed anything unusual about me.
I put it back and pretended nothing had happened, but I realized one thing in my heart. I could see traces of the past, not just memory, but vision, touch, and emotion. At that moment, I knew I had to keep this ability hidden. Otherwise, they would never believe that I solved the case through logic and was not crazy. It was late at night when I returned to the office. The preliminary DNA comparison results had just come out. I clicked on the screen, my fingertips trembling slightly. The results column clearly reads, "Match. Arthur Hawke." I stared at the name, almost thinking I had misread it. How is that possible? That was the DNA left by the murderer. How come it was highly consistent with the fingerprint record of a retired detective? I stood up suddenly and rushed to the data room, suspecting that there was a system misconfiguration. But after checking 3 times, the answer remains unchanged. Arthur's DNA was found on a cufflink that had been buried for 20 years. I clenched my fists, and all I could think about was the old man's trembling eyes. What is he hiding? Why should he protect that person? I looked back out the window. The night was so dark that it could not be dispelled, and this cufflink is just the first drop of rain in the storm. I stared at the name on the screen, as if nailed to the spot. Arthur Hawke. All the data matched. Fingerprints, handwriting, and even the blood sample he left when he took the on-site notes. The DNA was an exact match, almost as if the cufflink was one he had worn himself. I can't believe it, but the facts are right in front of me. Are you sure you're not mistaken? I asked in a low voice, almost gritting my teeth. Technician Robert frowned. We did 3 rounds of comparisons, Claire, and the results are consistent, unless someone tampered with the original database. My heart was shocked. Tampering with evidence? That's not something ordinary people can do. I walked quickly out of the data room and headed straight for the director's office, but was stopped by the secretary. He's already gone. I turned and rushed out of the police station. The night wind blew in my face, freezing cold. The phone vibrated. It's Emma Carter. I picked up the phone and she said hurriedly, "Claire, I just reread my sister's diary, and there was a sentence I had always overlooked. My uncle always used his left hand to tie my jacaranda headband." I stopped abruptly. Left hand. The cufflinks are also the old-fashioned silver ones that can only be fastened with the left hand. My fingers unconsciously touched the place where I had just held the cufflinks, as if I could still feel the touch of the cold metal. Emma continued, "You know what? My father and my uncle are both right-handed. Only..." She paused, as if she was afraid to say the name. I finished for her. "Only others." I hung up the phone, but these words kept echoing in my mind. Rebecca's uncle Edward, left-handed, and none of the witnesses from 20 years ago mentioned this. Thomas said that he saw a homeless man wearing an old jacket and did not pay attention to his left and right hands. Helen claimed that she was taking care of 6 sheep on the farm that night, and a neighbor testified to this. But now, everything has new possibilities. I went back to the office and dug out the photos of the scene, especially the photos around Rebecca's body. The 3rd button of her shirt was missing, but her cufflinks were intact. The murderer was wearing cufflinks, which is unlikely to be something a homeless person would do in that situation. I clicked on the DNA comparison report again, staring at Arthur's name, and an unprecedented suspicion arose in my heart. This is no coincidence. Something must be wrong. I must talk to him again. When we arrived at the nursing home, it was already past 11 o'clock in the evening. The nurse said that Arthur was very emotional, refused to take medicine, and locked himself in the room. I knocked on the door, no response. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, holding a yellowed photo in his hand, which was a picture of his son Sean as a teenager. He murmured to himself, "Impossible. How could I? That's not me. How could I leave the cufflinks behind?" His eyes were empty, as if he was fighting with himself. I walked over and asked quietly, "Arthur, did you touch the body?" He suddenly looked up at me, with a hint of fear in his eyes. "No, I remember it clearly. I didn't, but I was near the scene, and I went to Sean and he said he just pushed her. I thought she was knocked out. I thought..." He began to tremble violently, holding his head tightly in his hands. I stood there and watched this once ironclad man crumble into mud. But he must be hiding something, and now I have to find out the truth. On the way out of the nursing home, I called Emma. "Check something for me," I said. "I want to go see Thomas." "Thomas?" "The first witness in Rebecca's case. Where is he?" I took a deep breath and looked at the dark road ahead. old-time bookstore. At 11:47 in the evening, I stood at the door of the old-time bookstore and looked up at the mottled wooden door. Thomas Reed, the clerk who was on duty at a convenience store near the crime scene 20 years ago, is now the owner of this bookstore. I didn't have an appointment, but I knew he wouldn't turn down a visit from a police officer. When the door was opened, the old copper bell made a dull sound. The store was dimly lit, lined with bookshelves, and the air was filled with a mixture of paper and dust. Thomas was sitting behind the counter, flipping through a tattered novel. When he saw me come in, his expression changed slightly. "Detective Clare," he whispered, a hint of uneasiness in his tone. "Good evening." I took a few steps closer and handed him my ID. "I want to confirm some old things." He took the document, his fingers shaking a little. "Rebecca's business again?" "Yes." I looked him straight in the eye. "Do you remember what happened that night?" I remember a man in a leather jacket came to buy cigarettes." He frowned, as if trying to remember. He paid with his left hand. This is the first time I heard him mention this detail. "Left-handed?" I demanded. "Yes, that's right," he nodded. "I thought it was strange at the time because most people are right-handed. Why haven't you mentioned this before?" I demanded. "I did mention it." He looked confused. "At least I remember mentioning it. But maybe no one took it seriously." I was silent for a few seconds, but my heart was already in turmoil. 20 years ago, there was no record of a witness mentioning that the murderer was left-handed. If this is true, it means that someone deliberately ignored or even covered up this key information. "Do you remember any other characteristics of that person?" I continued to ask. He shook his head. "It's very vague. I only remember the leather jacket and my left hand." We chatted for a few more minutes, but he provided very little information. Before leaving, I took photos of the interior of the bookstore, especially where he usually sat, and the stairwell leading to the second floor. Less than 10 minutes after I walked out of the bookstore, my phone vibrated. The caller ID showed the name of a colleague from the Serious Crime Squad. "Claire, something happened." The voice on the other end of the phone was urgent. "Thomas is dead." I stopped abruptly. "What's going on?" It is said that a bookshelf at home collapsed and hit him on the head. When the emergency personnel arrived, he had no vital signs. I gripped my phone tightly, my heart beating faster.
I'll be right there.
At 2:13 in the morning, I stood in Thomas's house, and the scene was in chaos. The large wooden bookshelf that took up almost the entire wall collapsed completely, with books scattered all over the floor, and broken pieces of wood and glass covers scattered all over the floor. Thomas fell on his back, his head struck by a beam, the blood already dried. It looked like a typical household accident, but I noticed something was wrong at first glance. The tilt angle of the bookshelf is too strange, and the drag marks on the ground do not match the trajectory of natural collapse. I squatted down and carefully observed the part where the bookshelf touched the ground, and suddenly I felt a slight tingling sensation in my mind. This is my ability, which will automatically activate whenever I face some tiny but unusual details. I could see where it fell, like a slow-motion replay. In my mind's eye, the heavy bookshelf slowly tilted, not from age or an earthquake, but from someone giving it a strong push from behind. Even more suspicious was that I found a very tiny footprint on a wooden board at the bottom of the bookcase close to the ground. It was very shallow, as if it was caused by someone in sneakers stepping on it in a hurry. I pulled out my phone to take a picture, then carefully marked it with a sticker. Lisa, the forensic assistant, arrived shortly afterwards and whispered as she performed a preliminary autopsy. The time of death was probably more than an hour ago. I nodded, already having a hunch. This is no accident. This was a carefully planned accident, and the target was Thomas. Just as I was about to leave, I heard Lisa whisper, "That's a little strange."
"What?"
I turned around. She pointed at the forehead of the corpse and said, "There is a subtle impact mark here, and the location is much lower than the height where the bookshelf fell." This means that he might have been knocked unconscious first, and then caused the so-called bookshelf collapse incident. My heart sank, but this is not the scariest thing. The scariest thing is that if we hadn't noticed those suspicious points, this matter would have been closed as an ordinary household accident, and the real killer will once again quietly disappear into the darkness. I stood outside the door, the night wind blowing across my cheeks, as cold as iron. Edward Carter, are you trying to tell us that none of you who have witnessed the truth will remain? I couldn't help but clench my fists. This time, I won't let you have your way. I sat on a bench outside the morgue, clutching the preliminary autopsy report that Lisa had just given me. At 3:17 in the morning, the lights at the end of the corridor cast cold white shadows on the floor, like some kind of unfinished puzzle of evidence. The time of death was probably between 11:25 and 11:35 p.m. Lisa pointed to a page in the report, but the bookshelf should have fallen later, around 11. I stared at the words, my throat tightening. So, he was knocked unconscious first, and then the illusion of an accident was created. That's right. She nodded. And look here, the impact mark on the forehead. The force was not severe, but the position was very low, more like someone attacked from behind with a blunt object. I closed my eyes, and the image of the collapsed bookshelf in the bookstore appeared in my mind. The angle at which it tilted, the drag marks on the ground, and the shoe print.
Every detail told me this was not an accident but a murder.
A murder that was extremely cleverly disguised.
I stood up, put the report in my notebook, said thank you to Lisa, and walked quickly to the police archives room. The archive room at midnight is like a sleeping library, with only my footsteps echoing. I opened the file from 20 years ago and ran my fingers along the yellowed pages until I found the record of Thomas's testimony. I held my breath. Around 10 p.m. that evening, a man entered the convenience store to buy cigarettes. He was wearing a dark leather jacket and a hat, and he paid with his left hand. The following content abruptly stops, with no further description and no subsequent transcript to follow up on this key information. I looked through all the information, but I couldn't find the entry left-handed in Arthur Hawke's investigation notes. This is not right. How could such an important clue be ignored? I bit the pen cap and continued to check, and finally found a sentence in an internal meeting. Minutes with yellowed edges. The characteristics of the person described by the witness are vague, and the suspect cannot be identified for the time being. Blurred. Thomas made it very clear. I slammed the file shut, feeling a chill run up my spine. It was not omitted, it was deliberately erased. Who did it? Arthur? Or someone else? I dare not think further. After returning to the office, I turned on the computer, typed in Edward Carter's name, and pulled up his personal profile. He is 65 years old and runs an antique shop. He has no criminal record, but he has 3 tax anomalies, all of which were dropped due to insufficient evidence. I moved the cursor over an old photo of him. It was a picture of him buying a bronze vase at a charity auction 5 years ago. He held the bidding card in his right hand, and his left hand hung naturally. I zoomed in and looked closely at the gesture of his left hand. The way it naturally droops is very much like the posture of someone who habitually uses his left hand. What if Rebecca had really seen her uncle tie her jacaranda headband with his left hand? I stood up suddenly, grabbed my coat, and prepared to go find Emma. She is the keeper of Rebecca's diary, and may be able to help me confirm this. But before I walked out of the building, my phone started vibrating again. Caller ID, unknown number. I hesitated for a moment and answered the call. Claire Morgan? A deep female voice came from the other end of the phone. This is the emergency department of South District Hospital. We have just received a patient named Helen Miller. Her condition is critical. My heart skipped a beat. Helen, the farmer's widow, was one of the key witnesses who provided Arthur with an alibi. Her family hasn't been contacted yet, but we found your contact information in her belongings. She is a diabetic,
and her insulin pump seems to have problems. I held the phone tightly. My fingertips felt cold. She is now. We are still trying to save him, but his blood sugar is out of control. The doctor said the situation is not optimistic. I hung up the phone and stood there for a few seconds, with several keywords flashing quickly through my mind. Coincidence? Clearing witnesses? Still, I have to go and see. But I had a vague feeling that this wouldn't be just an ordinary medical accident. When I rushed to South District Hospital, Helen was still in the emergency room. The corridor was filled with the smell of disinfectant. The nurse said her blood sugar had dropped to a dangerous level, and she was holding a dog leash tightly before she fell into a coma. Bruno was temporarily detained in the police kennel. According to medical staff, when they arrived at the scene, the German Shepherd was lying at the door, covered in blood, with plastic fragments of the insulin pump scattered around its mouth. This is no accident. I requested a site inspection while I waited for the report. The crime scene was Helen's old farm in the suburbs. The door lock was intact, and the window was locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry. There was still soup simmering on the stove in the kitchen, and the TV was on the news channel, with the screen frozen on the weather forecast. It was as if death was just a dream that came suddenly. But as soon as I walked in, I felt something was wrong. There was a strange tension in the air, as if something was being deliberately covered up. I stood at the entrance and closed my eyes, letting that familiar feeling come to my mind. It first appeared when my father disappeared when I was 12 years old, and it allowed me to remember the position of every object, the angle of every ray of light, and even the smell that lingered in the air. I opened my eyes and walked towards the bedroom. The marks on the bedside table were the most obvious. It was not pushed down, but was pulled down violently. The pump body fragments were concentrated near the bed, but the dog's paw prints were almost all in the doorway area. This doesn't make sense. If Bruno was the one who pounced on his owner to grab the insulin pump, why didn't he rush into the bedroom? Instead, it was led to the door before it started biting. I retrieved the scene map and combined it with surveillance video and neighbor testimony to reconstruct Bruno's behavior trajectory that day. It does not spontaneously attack the owner's belongings. It is following orders. I contacted Tom, the police dog trainer, and asked him to help analyze Bruno's behavioral patterns. After listening to my speculation, he was silent for a few seconds, and then said, "Unless someone stimulates its emotions with familiar instructions or unfamiliar smells, it will never do this to its owner." I looked at Bruno's photo and a thought flashed through my mind. What if the murderer used some kind of bait, such as Edward's handkerchief, or an object used by Rebecca when she was alive? I returned to the police station and immediately applied to track Edward's whereabouts for the past 2 weeks. When was the last time he visited the farm? Was there any smell left that didn't belong to him? The clues slowly came together like pieces of a puzzle, but I had a bad feeling in my heart. These coincidences are so perfect. Thomas died when a bookshelf collapsed, and now Helen died when her dog lost control. Each of them seems to be a natural death, but behind them there are traces of human manipulation. I called Arthur and was answered by the front desk clerk at his nursing home. I said I wanted to see him right away. When I showed up at his door, he was feeding the birds at the window, a dry crumb in his hand. The sun shone through the branches of the jacaranda trees, casting dappled shadows on his face. "You're here," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "I heard that Helen..." "Dead," I interrupted. The collie ripped up her insulin pump. His hands shook, and the breadcrumbs scattered all over the floor. Neither of us spoke. The wind blew the curtains, and the church bells rang in the distance. After a long while he whispered, "She said something that I never dared to tell you." I held my breath. "Rebecca came to see me a week before the accident. She said she knew a secret that could destroy the entire family. At that time I thought she was talking about Sean, saying that her relationship with Sean would be discovered." He raised his head, his eyes dazed and painful. "But now I remember, she didn't mean our family. she said. The Carter family. I sat across from Arthur, watching his trembling fingers sweep the crumbs from the table into his palms. The sunlight filtered in through the gaps in the jacaranda trees, casting the same spot of light on Rebecca's face that afternoon 20 years ago when the crime happened.
Sean, did you really push her?
I asked softly. Arthur closed his eyes, his Adam's apple rolling. He said it was just an argument. He said Rebecca fell down, and he panicked and didn't dare to tell me. His voice was low and hoarse, as if it came from deep in his chest. I was too confused at the time. I was silent for a moment, then asked, "Then do you know what Rebecca said to you that day? What was the secret she was talking about?" Arthur's eyes wandered for a moment, as if he was trying to recall something. She said she knew a secret that could destroy the entire family. At the time I thought she was talking about Sean, saying that her relationship with Sean would be discovered. But now I remember, she didn't say our family. He looked up, his eyes dazed and painful. She said, "The Carter family." My heart sank. Carter's house. Edward Carter. The name echoed in my mind like some long-forgotten but latent truth. I immediately retrieved the alibi document that Helen had provided, which was the testimony signed by the farmer's widow and submitted to the police as important evidence. I enlarged the handwriting on the computer and compared it word by word. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong. Her signature has stiff strokes and lacks a natural and coherent rhythm at the turns, and it is obvious that it was imitated by someone else. I immediately contacted the archives department and asked them to retrieve the signature samples from the original records of the old case. Sure enough, the two signatures were almost completely different. After further investigation, I was surprised to find that this alibi was not submitted by Helen herself, but was handled by a man who called himself Edward Carter and attached a seemingly formal power of attorney. The time point was exactly 3 days after Rebecca was murdered. I clenched the documents in my hand, and my breathing quickened slightly. This is no coincidence. This was an elaborate perjury plot. Not only had Edward been involved in the case for a long time, but he also began to interfere with the direction of the investigation as early as the early stages of the case. He used his identity to forge evidence to cover up the fact that he was left-handed, and might even take the opportunity to frame Sean. What if Sean is really the only one who has ever been in close contact with Rebecca? What if he knew something, but never got the chance to speak up because of his father's meddling? I stood up, stuffed the information into my bag, and decided to go talk to Sean. But before I go, I have to go somewhere first. Carter Antiques, a place Rebecca often visited during her lifetime. It is also the place where Edward hides the deepest. As I walked out of the nursing home, I looked back at Arthur. He was still sitting by the window holding a worn jacaranda headband in his hand, the style mentioned in Rebecca's diary. His lips moved slightly, as if he was apologizing to someone. I turned and left, knowing full well in my heart that reopening this old case was far more than just opening up past wounds. It's a revenge, a reckoning that is 20 years overdue. I stood in front of Carter's Antiques, my fingers gently stroking the edge of the police badge. This is a second-hand shop hidden deep in an alley in the center of Melbourne. There are a few yellowed porcelain and faded silverware in the window. The door plate reads Carter's Antique Shop. The sunlight shines in obliquely through the glass, and dust floats slowly in the beam of light. When I pushed the door open, the wind chimes rang. Edward Carter was standing behind the counter polishing a brass candlestick. He raised his head with a gentle smile on his face. "Welcome." I showed my ID. "Claire Morgan, Melbourne Crime Squad. We are reopening the case of Rebecca Carter, and would like to learn about any items she may have left behind." He put down the candlestick, wiped his hands and smiled. "Rebecca, she is my niece. I hope you can find out the truth." I approached the counter and glanced over him. He was wearing a dark suit, with his right hand supporting the counter, and his left hand hanging naturally, but not against his side, but on his waist.
as if habitually to stabilize his body. That posture is not casual, but a kind of body memory formed over a long period of time. Left-handed habits. Alarm bells started ringing in my heart. On the surface, I just continued chatting. I heard that Rebecca used to come to your place often. Yes, Edward sighed. She likes old things, especially jacaranda wood carvings. I nodded, my eyes casually glancing towards the corner of the store. An old leather jacket hung on the hanger. It was dark in color, with badly worn edges and traces of drying at the collar. That jacket. I pointed. Can I see it? Edward was slightly startled, but quickly nodded. Of course. I walked over, reached out to take off the jacket and sniffed it. There was a scent of old tobacco mixed with damp wood. When I turned to the lining, I found some tiny traces of blue petals on the edge of the collar. Jacaranda. I calmly folded my jacket. We need to take it back to the lab for routine sampling. His smile remained unchanged. Please. Walking out of the antique shop, I looked back. The wind chimes rang again, and Edward's figure disappeared in the light and shadow, as if he had never moved. Back at the police station, I handed the jacket to Technician Daniel. Focus on checking the residue on the collar, and also, what kind of movement habits does someone who has worn this jacket for a long time have? He took the jacket and looked at me. You mean, the murderer might have worn it? I didn't answer, just smiled. Then I went to the handwriting laboratory. This is the signature on the alibi Helen submitted that year. I handed him the scanned copy. Compare it with this copy. Daniel put on a magnifying glass and compared them carefully for a moment, frowning. Although the characters of these two signatures are similar, the rhythm of the strokes is completely different. This so-called Helen's signature is obviously an imitation, and the imitator's level is not high. He deliberately imitated the way of connecting the strokes, but ignored the changes in strength. My heart tightened. Is it possible that the same person wrote it? Impossible. He shook his head. These are the work of two people, and the imitator is very familiar with Helen's original writing style. You can even say that he sees it every day. I was silent for a few seconds, then whispered, "What if we compare this forged signature with Edward Carter's daily handwriting?" He looked up at me, said nothing, and silently pulled up a document. A few minutes later, the results came out, totally consistent. I immediately contacted Emma. Can you confirm one thing for me? Does Edward usually write with his left hand? The person on the other end of the phone paused. How did you know? He has been left-handed since he was a child. His grandmother tried to correct him when he was a child, but he couldn't change. After hanging up the phone, I sat in my office, staring at the jacket bag on my desk. Then I turned on Goldfinger. This is a strange ability. Whenever I find a key item or touch an important clue at the scene, a vague image will emerge in my mind. It is not an illusion, nor a dream, but more like some fragment of a picture sealed in time, which only I can see. I closed my eyes and touched my fingertips to the collar of my jacket. Suddenly, everything went dark before my eyes, and then the picture flashed. A figure walked in the night in the suburbs of Melbourne, wearing this jacket, with his left hand in his pocket and his step steady. He walked into a convenience store, walked to the cashier, and took out change from his pocket with his left hand, with quick movements. That was the footage taken 2 days before Thomas's death. This was also the outfit Rebecca wore on the night she was murdered. I opened my eyes, my heart beating like a drum. This is not a coincidence. It is evidence. I compiled all the information into an electronic file and sent it to Emma, with a note. Your sister mentioned in her diary that her uncle always used his left hand to help her tie the jacaranda headband. After sending it successfully, I stood up and picked up the car keys. I'm going to the nursing home and talk to Arthur. About Sean, about Rebecca, about that night, 20 years ago. I know Arthur has been avoiding this, but today, I have to force him to face it, because he doesn't have many sober days left, and the truth should come to light. It was dark when I drove to the nursing home. The
The wind from the suburbs of Melbourne came in through the gaps in the car window, carrying the fragrance of jacaranda trees. The smell was very much like the scent emanating from the yellowed corners of photos in old files. Old, bitter, and with a hint of unspeakable sadness. Arthur lived in a single room on the second floor, next to the window, with a quiet oak forest outside. When I pushed the door open, he was sitting in a wheelchair in a daze, holding a yellowed photo in his hand. It was a fragment of a photo of Sean and Rebecca in front of the wooden cabin 20 years ago, and there were still traces of fire burns in the corner of the photo. "You're here." His voice was hoarse, as if squeezed out from the depths of his throat. I didn't say anything. I just walked over and put a document on the bedside table. It was a copy of the internal records of the destruction of Sean's clothes that year. I deliberately let his eyes scan one of the lines of words. "The items have been rendered harmless." He stared at the words for a long time, then suddenly began to shake his head, muttering to himself. He said he pushed her. I thought it was just an argument. I squatted down and looked him straight in the eye. "Arthur, you said that Sean had blood on his clothes when he came home that night. Do you remember?" He shuddered. A trace of fear flashed in his eyes. "I can't let him go to jail. I can't. He is my son. I am a policeman. I should protect justice. But I can only protect him first." "But have you ever thought," I asked softly, "that you are protecting the wrong person?" He was stunned, and his eyes became empty in an instant, as if his soul had been taken away for a moment. Then he began to repeat, "I can't let him go to jail. I can't." I knew he was in a state of memory confusion. This feeling of collapse caused by Alzheimer's disease is like a slow and silent murder. I gently closed the document and turned to leave while he was still repeating the sentence in a low voice. In the dark of night, I called Sean. We met at a riverside cafe, a location he had chosen, with a window seat so he could watch people coming in and out. He was thinner than in the video, and his eyes were wandering, like a trapped animal. After we exchanged a few insignificant words, I tentatively asked, "Did your father destroy your clothing as evidence?" As soon as he finished speaking, his face changed suddenly, and he stood up suddenly, and the chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound. I reached out and grasped his wrist. Not hard, but enough to make him stop. "If you know anything, please tell me." I lowered my voice. "Otherwise, the real murderer will never stop." He looked at me. His breathing quickened, beads of sweat oozing from his forehead. After a few seconds, he slowly sat down. His eyes fell on the table, as if he saw some distant picture. That night, he finally spoke, his voice almost inaudible. "I'm not the murderer, but I did take action. I held my breath. I just pushed her. She fell on a rock and I thought she fainted. I was terrified and ran back home. Dad saw the blood on my clothes and didn't ask anything, just said, 'Don't be afraid.' Then he asked me to take a shower and change my clothes. I clenched my fists, but I know now." He looked up at me, his eyes full of regret and fear. "She didn't die from that push. She was strangled to death." I stood up and put the phone to my ear, ready to contact Emma. She said she wanted to take me to a place. I heard myself say, "Would you like to go with me?" Sean was silent for a few seconds and nodded. I put away my phone and looked at the dark river outside the window. I had a vague premonition in my heart. Tomorrow, we will open the long sealed wardrobe, and the truth may be hidden inside. If only I could see it. It was almost dark when I followed Emma into the old cabin. The house was kept by Rebecca's family after she was murdered, and was later converted into a family memorial room. There was a faded specimen of jacaranda hanging at the door, which swayed gently in the wind, as if someone was shaking it. Emma pushed open the door, and the smell of damp wood hit her in the face. She didn't turn on the light, but just stood at the door in silence for a few seconds, then whispered, "Do you remember? She said there is a secret hidden in the closet." I didn't answer, but followed her into the house. In the dim light, I could sense what had happened in this space. It is not empty like an ordinary room, but like a container frozen in time, with every breath of air solidified with some unresolved emotions. We walked through the living room, the kitchen, and finally stopped at the bedroom door. It was an old oak wardrobe with a mottled surface, and the copper on the handles had oxidized and turned black. I reached out and opened the door, and dust flew in my face. But at that moment, I took a sudden step back, my heart almost skipping a beat, not because of the dust, but because I saw 7-year-old Emma curled up in the corner of the closet, her eyes wide open, her lips trembling slightly, and her hands covering her mouth tightly. Her body clung to the clothes, as if she wanted to melt into the fabric. And outside, there were footsteps, heavy and slowly approaching, followed by the sound of arguing. "You said you wouldn't tell anyone." "You're crazy, that's my uncle, how could you?" Then there was a sound of struggling, and then a deep male voice stopped in front of the wardrobe. "Just shut up forever." At that moment, my ears were buzzing and my chest felt like it was hit by a hammer. I staggered a few steps, holding onto the wall, breathing rapidly. "Claire?" Emma looked at me in panic. "What's wrong with you?" I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. "It's okay, just a little dizzy." I lied. I knew what had just happened. My ability had activated. That ability to heighten my memory of details allows me to see after images of certain moments in the past, especially when the emotions are strong enough. "We need to see a psychiatrist," I said to Emma. "I want to help you dig out that memory completely." Lisa Ferguson's clinic is tucked away in a quiet lane in central Melbourne, with soft lighting and the scent of lavender in the air. Emma lay on the sofa with her eyes closed. Lisa sat next to her and gently guided her back to that night. I stood in the corner, holding my breath, watching Emma's face turn pale little by little. Suddenly, her fingers began to twitch. He was wearing a black leather jacket and silver cufflinks on his left hand. My heart was shocked. "Can you see his face?" Lisa asked gently. No, it was too dark, but he bent over and checked if my sister was breathing. And then he said, "You shut up forever." I could barely hold the recorder. "Anything else?" Emma frowned and thought for a few seconds before slowly speaking. "He speaks with a British accent." When I walked out of the clinic, the night wind blew in my face, but I didn't feel cold. I immediately contacted the police department's technical department and retrieved a photo of Edward when he was young, and a recording of him being interviewed. I repeatedly compared the tone and rhythm of the sentence "shut up forever" on my phone. Almost exactly the same. Black leather jacket, left-handedness, silver cufflinks, British accent. These fragments finally began to piece together into a complete face. "Claire," Emma suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "Do you remember what you said in the closet?" "Which one?"
He said you are crazy.
"That's my uncle. How could you?" I was shocked. Rebecca knew the identity of the murderer back then. She knew it was her uncle. She wanted to speak out, but was silenced. I looked up at the night sky, and for the first time that name appeared so clearly in my mind. Edward Carter. On the way back, I received a message from the archives. "Claire, this is Nora." Her slightly tired voice came from the other end of the phone. "I just found a copy. A week before the incident, someone applied for a temporary visa to Canada. The applicant's name was Edward Carter." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my heartbeat quickening. "He didn't go to Canada," I said. "Yes." Nora paused, and this record has been at the bottom of the old files for 20 years, as if someone had deliberately forgotten it. I stared at the dark road ahead, with only one thought in my mind. This is no coincidence. This is a truth that has been carefully concealed, and now it is crawling out of the dusty closet, little by little. My fingertips trembled slightly as I stared at the scan Nora sent me. Edward Carter. These 4 words are engraved on my retina like a brand. A crooked ink mark on the signature column seemed to still carry the haste and panic he felt at the moment he wrote it. He falsified his exit records. This is not a coincidence or a miscalculation. It's a complete scam. I locked my phone, leaned back in the chair in the police archives room, and took a deep breath. Nora stood beside me, flipping through the dusty entry and exit registration book, and whispered. The review system back then was far less rigorous than it is now, especially for temporary visa applications. As long as you can provide some overseas contact information, you can get it approved. But the problem is, she looked up at me. This person didn't leave at all. I nodded, and a complete picture was already formed in my mind. 20 years ago, Rebecca discovered that her uncle had embezzled the inheritance and tried to expose it. In order to cover up his crime, Edward carefully prepared a false appearance of being abroad before the incident. He submitted his visa application a week ago and arranged for witnesses, Thomas and Helen, to identify a homeless man who did not exist at all, but the one who was actually standing under the jacaranda tree, and in that wooden house, was himself. He even did a Sean imitation. I muttered.
What did you say?
Nora frowned. I stood up suddenly, stuffed the copies into a folder, and said as I walked out, Arthur's son Sean was right-handed, and the murderer was left-handed, but Edward is left-handed. Nora was stunned. You mean, Sean wasn't the murderer? I said. He was the scapegoat. When I walked out of the archives room, I almost ran all the way back to the office. On the computer screen, I have connected all the clues into an impenetrable network. Edward's accent, his left-handedness, the eyewitness description of the wardrobe, the EC initials on the cufflinks, and most importantly, Rebecca's last words before she died. That's my uncle. I pulled up the arrest warrant application form and started filling it out. But just as I was entering the suspect's name column, my phone vibrated. This is a message from the technical team. Edward Carter closed the store early this morning and changed the door locks. There are no surveillance records in the store. His cell phone number has been turned off. My heart sank. He noticed it. What's worse is that he left early. I immediately retrieved all the information about Edward from the old case files, including address, social circle, and asset information. On the last page, there was a line of words written. The address of the former residence is 19 Oak Ridge, eastern suburbs of Melbourne. That was the old house left by his parents, and where Rebecca grew up as a child. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door. When I kicked open the rusty iron door, dust flew in my face. The study was empty, and the bookshelves were unusually neat, as if they had been deliberately organized. But I found it anyway. Behind the fireplace in the corner, there is a piece of floor that is slightly raised. I squatted down and used my baton to pry open the wooden floor, revealing a secret compartment. Inside lay a black leather diary. Turning to the last page, a scribbled but clear sentence jumped into my eyes. They thought it was murder, but it was actually punishment. I clenched it, my heart pounding. This is more than a confession. It's more like a declaration. Punish. Who is he punishing? I was about to get up when I suddenly heard light footsteps outside. Someone has been here, and it was not long ago. I quickly glanced around, my eyes landing on the dark suburban woodland outside the window. Some intuition told me that he was not far away. Very close. So close that I could smell the jacarandas. I stood in front of an abandoned warehouse, pistol in hand, the bitter scent of jacaranda trees wafting in the wind. The SWAT team was already in position, and 3 black vehicles were slowly approaching on the muddy ground. This place is less than 5 kilometers away from Edward's old house, hidden in an abandoned industrial area in the suburbs, like a wild beast that has been dormant for many years. Confirmed that the suspect is still in the building. The commander's voice came over the intercom. I nodded, my throat tightening. This should have been the most exciting moment, but I always felt something was wrong. It was too quiet. Even the sound of wind blowing through leaves sounded like deliberately suppressed breaths. The moment the door was broken, strong light pierced into the darkness. I was the first to rush in, and the iron plate under my feet made a hollow echo. The air smelled of mold and old blood. No one, only one person. Edward fell in the corner, his face pale and his lips chapped, as if he had been unconscious for a long time. There were no external injuries on his body, but there was an obvious mark of strangulation on his neck, as if he had been dragged on the ground with a rope. He still has a heartbeat. A police officer checked his condition. I didn't get closer, but slowly glanced around. The walls are covered with photos of Rebecca, newspaper clippings, and even kitten drawings she made as a child. In the center was a yellowed family photo. Edward stood behind her with a gentle smile, but his eyes were as cold as ice. There was a pile of letters neatly placed on the table, each with a different recipient written on it. To Rebecca's mother, to Sean Hawke, to Arthur Hawke. I opened the top one, and the handwriting was scribbled and hurried. They thought I killed her, but I just completed her unfinished trial. My brother gave her everything, and she found out about me. I put the letter away and continued searching. All the letters were accusations, saying that Rebecca had discovered his money laundering and was going to call the police, that he just wanted to scare her that day, but she fell down the stairs and hit her head, that he was left-handed, so he imitated Sean's right-handed habits, that he wrote punishment in his diary, not to excuse himself, but to let her know that her justice would eventually come. I bit my lower lip and my eyes became hot. No trace of the third person was found at the scene. The technical team member whispered. I nodded, but I knew in my heart someone had been here before us. The incandescent lights in the hospital corridor were blindingly cold. Nurse Michelle came over with a medicine tray and sighed when she saw me. You're here after all. How's Arthur? She shook her head. The doctor said his Alzheimer's has worsened, and he's confused. He kept yelling, Sean. I was silent for a moment, then asked, did he meet anyone before he was hospitalized? Michelle hesitated. His son. He never woke up after that meeting. My heart suddenly tightened. Did he say anything? He said, sorry. I looked down at the letters and diary in my hands, and my throat felt like something was blocking it. I was on my way back to the office when the phone rang. The caller ID shows an anonymous number. Hello? I picked up. Claire, a hoarse male voice came from the other end, with a crying tone. I'm Sean. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and said nothing. I want to turn myself in, he said. It's not that you just remembered it now, I said calmly. He paused. My father has protected me all my life, but I just realized today that it wasn't protection at all. It was his own knot. I closed my eyes, and the scene of that night emerged in my mind. A young boy wiped the blood on the floor of the wooden house with trembling hands, and the jacaranda flowers outside the window were in full bloom. Go ahead, I said. He choked up and said, I did push her that day. I didn't mean to. We had an argument. She said she wanted to expose my father for forging evidence. I was so excited at the time. I thought she was dead, but later my dad came and said he would take care of it and asked me to go home and change my clothes. I listened without interrupting. I was wrong, he said hoarsely. I just want you to know the truth now. Before I hung up the phone, I whispered, this isn't redemption. This is honesty. A few days later, I presented all the evidence in court. Emma testified in court and read out the following passage from her sister's diary. My uncle always ties my jacaranda headband with his left hand. At that moment, everyone looked at Edward in the dock. He remained silent, but a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. When the judge announced that the verdict would be announced at a later date, I stood up and walked out of the courtroom. The wind was so strong that the jacarandas fell all over the ground. I wrote the last sentence at the end of the report. Justice may be late, but it is never absent. But I know that some things cannot end easily. For example, regret, the truth, and the words that an old policeman failed to say before his death. I'm sorry. I stood at Rebecca's grave, holding a jacaranda in my hand. The petals had dried up a bit, and the color had faded to the yellowish purple in old photos. The wind blew in from the suburbs of Melbourne, bringing with it the smell of dampness and earth, and also taking away the breath I had just held back in court. Emma was very calm when she testified in court today. Her voice didn't tremble, and her eyes didn't avoid. When she finished reading that diary entry, the entire courtroom seemed to have been muted. My uncle always used his left hand to tie my jacaranda headband. Everyone looked at Edward in the dock. He remained silent, but a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. At that moment I knew we had won. It was not based on DNA, nor on the long blurred cuff link, but on the memory of a child hidden in the closet, a diary that had been sealed for 20 years, and the most ordinary words left by her sister. Justice may be late, but it is never absent. My pen paused as I wrote this sentence in the case report. Then I added silently in my mind, some mistakes should not be forgiven. Just like how Arthur erased the evidence for his son Sean. Just like how Edward hid behind the light and disguised himself as a relative to commit crimes. Just like the cold calculations behind those so-called accidents. Neither is a reason to forgive. I bent down and placed the jacaranda in front of the tombstone. Rebecca's name was engraved on the stone, and next to it was the year she died, 2003, at the age of 17. "You've been waiting," I said. When I turned to leave, my eyes were a little wet, but I didn't look back. The wind was getting stronger and stronger, making the hem of my coat rustle. After returning to the office, I handed Rebecca's diary to the evidence department for final scanning and archiving. Emma said this was the only complete handwritten record in her family, and she hoped it could be preserved. As the system was automatically turning the pages, I noticed that one of the pages had slight marks of tearing. The technician frowned. "This page of paper has been repaired. It may have been pasted on later." I stared at the screen and my heart beat faster. They began to use spectral scanning to restore the underlying handwriting, and the picture gradually became clearer. "Just a small paragraph," Uncle said, "that he wouldn't leave home unless I kept my mouth shut." I stood up suddenly, my fingers tightly gripping the corner of the table. It turns out that it's not just a question of inheritance. It turned out that Rebecca had known for a long time that she couldn't tell anyone. She is not afraid of death. She was afraid that once she opened her mouth, her family would break up, but she still said it, so she died. I stood in front of the screen and didn't speak for a long time. This is not the end. At least for some people, it's far from the end. I stared at the blurry yet clear words on the screen, and my heartbeat seemed to be gripped by something. Uncle said that only if I shut up, he wouldn't leave home. This is more than just a murder. This is control, a threat, and a time bomb that has been planted long ago. Rebecca was not killed by accident. She knew too much and chose to speak out. Emma sat across from me, her brows furrowed. I don't remember my sister saying this, but I do remember that she often went to Carter's antique store. She said she was helping her uncle sort out the accounts, but every time she came back, her face didn't look right. "Did she mention anything strange?" I asked. Emma shook her head. "I was only 7 years old at that time, so I don't remember many things clearly. But there was one time that I remember very clearly. My sister went home and locked herself in her room, crying for a long time. I saw her tearing paper through the crack in the door, and there were crumbs all over the floor. Later she came out, smiled and said it was okay. Just dust in her eyes." My heart was shocked. That was probably the first time she realized what kind of person she was facing. I immediately contacted the archives and retrieved the tax records of Carter's antique store from that year. Nora rummaged through it for a while and handed me a scan. "Look at this." She pointed to several fund flows. "These accounts are all registered in the names of offshore companies. The amounts are not small, and there are fixed remittance records every year. We didn't focus on investigating them at the time because on paper they were all in the name of art import and export. I stared at the numbers, and a picture gradually emerged in my mind. Edward used the antique shop as a cover to launder money for a long time, and Rebecca discovered all this by accident. What's even more terrifying is that she told others. Who is that person? I thought of Sean. He was Rebecca's secret boyfriend back then. Maybe he knew something. I called him. No one answered. Just as I was about to hang up, the call was suddenly connected. I'm Sean. His voice was a little hoarse, as if he had just woken up from a dream. I'm Claire. Are you ready to talk now? He was silent for a few seconds, then whispered, My father is critically ill. I'm in the hospital. My heart skipped a beat. Arthur's condition was worse than I thought. Did you see Rebecca in her last few days? I asked tentatively. Yes. His voice suddenly trembled. She said something that I have never dared to tell anyone. She said, My uncle is not a good person. He knows what I have discovered, and will do something to me sooner or later. I thought she was joking. My fingers tightened around the phone. It turned out that Rebecca had a premonition. She knew she was going to die, but she didn't run away. She chose to speak out. Unfortunately, no one believed her. I took a deep breath. Sean, your father has always been protecting you, but he doesn't know that the person who really needs to be protected is Rebecca. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his breathing, rapid and painful. Thank you for telling me this, I said, and hung up. Sitting in the office, I looked out the window at the dusk in Melbourne, and my heart felt heavy. This case is far more complicated than we thought. Edward did not kill on impulse. He had planned it for a long time, and was willing to do anything to cover up the truth. And Rebecca, the 17-year-old girl, had already seen through him. I turned on the computer and typed in the keywords: child trauma counseling, memory regression, and psychological intervention. I'm going to find someone. Lisa Ferguson. She specializes in the impact of major childhood events on memory, and is skilled at using hypnosis and guidance to help patients recall forgotten details.
Emma witnessed part of the process while hiding in the closet, but her memory is now blurry.
If more details can be brought to light, perhaps the key evidence that Edward committed the crime can be found. I closed my notebook, stood up, and looked out the window at the jacaranda trees. The wind is still blowing, and flower petals fall on the windowsill, like a vow gently made by someone. I didn't even look at the case report again. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. It was dark when I drove Emma to Lisa Ferguson's psychiatric clinic. The jacaranda trees on both sides of the street were covered with fallen leaves, like a silent snowfall. Are you sure you want to do this? I asked her. Emma nodded, her eyes firm, but with a hint of uneasiness. I always remember the smell of that wardrobe. Wood, camphor, and blood. She's a brave person, much braver than most. Lisa opened the door to greet us. The lights in the house were soft, and there was a faint scent of lavender in the air. There were a few abstract paintings on the walls, and in the corner was an old gramophone playing soft classical music. We'll take it slow. Lisa's voice was very soft, as if she was afraid of disturbing something sleeping. What we want to do is not to force her to recall, but to let her find a path to the depths of her memory by herself. Emma sat down and closed her eyes. Lisa began to guide her breathing, using slow, steady sounds to bring her into a state between wakefulness and dreaming. I sat aside and held my breath. Time seemed to have stood still. Then her lips moved. I'm in the closet. The door is very small. It's dark outside. She paused, and her voice suddenly trembled. He came in. It was my uncle. He was wearing black clothes, and had something silver on his left hand. It looked like a butt. My heart skipped a beat. He was looking at Rebecca, crouching down to look at her, reaching out and touching her neck. And he said, "You're too smart to survive." After she said this, her whole body began to tremble violently. I rushed forward and held her hand, and Lisa quickly adjusted her rhythm, slowly pulling her back to reality. When Emma opened her eyes, Her face was as pale as paper, but her eyes were clear as if she had finally seen the truth. "Did I tell you?" she asked me. "You told me everything." I nodded. Just as we were leaving the clinic, Nora sent a message. "Claire, I found a photo that was tucked into the case files from that year, and almost no one noticed it. On April 19th, 2003, Rebecca argued with a man in a black leather jacket in the alley behind the antique store. He wore a silver cufflink on his left wrist, exactly the same as the one found in the cemetery. I stood in the night wind, my fingers tightly grasping the phone, my palms full of sweat. This is irrefutable evidence, but we still have one last step to go. I had to review the bank statements of Carter's antique store for the past 20 years to fully uncover how this man used the store to launder money, and how he covered up his crimes step by step. The next morning, I went to the federal police headquarters and submitted a request for access. The receptionist glanced at me and shook her head slightly. The bank responded that they refused to cooperate on the grounds of the Customer Privacy Protection Act. I stared at the rejection document with my fists clenched tightly. He knew we were approaching, so he has begun blocking all possible outlets for evidence. But I won't stop. I know who can help me. It's just that person is the last person I want to ask for help. I know I'm crazy, but for this case, I no longer care about decency or rules. Emma looked at me with a complicated look in her eyes. "You mean, let me pretend to be an auditor?" "Yes," I said. "You've done financial investigative reporting before, so you're familiar with banking procedures." Carter's antique store account was opened at the Melbourne City branch of the Southern Bank. We only need to retrieve bank statements from the past 20 years to find out his money laundering route. She was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "Okay, I'll try." Things went much more smoothly than I expected. Emma, wearing a well-tailored suit, black-framed glasses, and holding a forged audit letter from the Ministry of Finance, was not even stopped and asked too many questions when she walked into the bank. My palms were sweating as I waited in the cafe across the street. After 3 full hours, she finally came out. Done. She placed a USB drive in front of me. "Here are all the transactions for Edward's account, as well as several linked accounts. But, Claire, you have to take a look at this." I took the USB drive and plugged it into my laptop. My heartbeat quickened as the file opened. "The Jacaranda Foundation?" I read the name on the screen and frowned. "Is it a non-profit?" "On the surface, yes." Emma flipped through the copy she brought back from the bank, but from 2003 to 2010, it continuously received fund transfers from Edward's account with a cumulative amount of more than 2 million yuan. "This is not right," I whispered. "How could a person who has been missing for many years frequently transfer money to a foundation?" And the timing was exactly around the time when Rebecca was murdered. I was just about to continue looking down when someone knocked on the door. It was David Miller, the bank executive who had received me. He stood at the door, his face a little pale. "Detective Morgan," he said, lowering his voice, "I don't know who you're investigating, but I suggest you stop investigating that account. It's not an ordinary account." I stared at him and said nothing. "I noticed it when you applied to access your account statements," he said. "I thought it was strange that an antique shop would be connected to such a foundation, so I checked it myself." He pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to me. It lists several transaction details, with the time, amount and recipient clearly stated. The money eventually flowed to an offshore company called Orion Investments. He paused, his eyes becoming serious. "The registered owner of this company is Rebecca's father, James Carter." I raised my head suddenly. "James Carter?" I could hardly believe my ears. "That's right," David nodded. 5 years before his death, this company was established overseas, and most of the account funds came from the so-called Jacaranda Foundation. In other words, there was a boom in my head. That is to say, Edward didn't kill people just for the inheritance. He had planned it long ago, and he started planning it even before his brother died. David sighed. The man you are investigating is not a simple murderer. He is a premeditated robber. He didn't say anything else, just looked at me and turned away. I sat there for a long time without moving. Lisa walked in, saw my expression, and immediately realized something was wrong. What's wrong? I pushed the paper towards her. She glanced at it and her expression changed. This is the final link in the chain of evidence, I whispered. We now know that Edward did not kill Rebecca on impulse. As early as when her father was still alive, he transferred assets through illegal means, which may even have affected the authenticity of the will. Lisa was flipping through the documents and suddenly stopped. Wait, did you notice? The ultimate beneficiary of Orion investment has not been clearly shown because it's an offshore company, I said. But we can apply for international judicial assistance. She nodded, then hesitated. Claire, do you remember what Rebecca wrote in her diary? She said her uncle always used his left hand to tie her hair. I remember. Then, she raised her head, a gleam in her eyes. If she really discovered what her uncle was doing, she would definitely leave more clues. I took a deep breath. We have to find what she left behind. It was late at night, and the wind was howling outside the window, as if it was going to blow out all the secrets of the past. And I know this is just the beginning. I sat across the interrogation room, staring at Edward Carter's wrinkled but still indifferent face. He was wearing detention clothes. His hands were handcuffed to the table, but his eyes were as steady as a hunter's, as if this moment was just a routine, rather than the end point where the lie he had carefully woven for 20 years finally collapsed. I unfolded the printed materials page by page, and the paper had a metallic luster under the cold white light. On February 17th, 2003, you transferred 850,000 Australian dollars from the Jacaranda Foundation to the Orion investment account, I said, my voice steady. On the same day, Rebecca filed an application to the Melbourne Magistrates Court to object to the validity of the will. The corners of Edward's mouth moved, as if he wanted to laugh, but he didn't. We found the paralegal from that time. She said Rebecca was holding a stack of her father's letters. She suspected that you had forged the will and planned to thoroughly investigate your relationship with her father's financial dealings. I paused and turned to the next page. She wrote in her diary, "My uncle always ties my hair with his left hand." This sentence is now the key evidence, combined with the cufflinks engraved with EC left at the crime scene, and Emma's identification of you as a left-handed person, plus the bank statements, the flow of foundation funds, and Rebecca's attempt to overturn the will. Your motives are clear as can be. I looked straight into his grey-blue eyes and continued. She had already sensed something was wrong before you took action, and was even preparing to sue you for property embezzlement. You killed her first because you were afraid she would reveal the truth and destroy everything you had worked so hard to build. The room was very quiet, with only the slight hum of the air conditioner. After a long while, Edward finally spoke. She shouldn't meddle in family affairs. His voice was low and hoarse, like a spell coming from deep underground. I didn't respond, but simply pushed the doctored copy of the will in front of him. According to the forensic report, Rebecca died at around 2 a.m. on April 12, 2003. You showed up at a private clinic in the city early that morning and were injected with sedatives. This shows that you were extremely emotionally unstable after the murder. You thought no one would notice the small movements of an old-school antique dealer, but the traces don't lie. Edward didn't say anything else, but just lowered his head and looked at the will. After a moment he smiled softly, as if he had finally admitted something, or as if he was laughing at himself for losing in the end. I stood up and closed the folder. You shouldn't think that time can cover up everything. As I walked out of the interrogation room, my phone vibrated. It's the hospital calling. I answered the phone and heard the voice of Nurse Michelle. Detective Morgan. Mr. Hawke just had a sudden attack and is now in the emergency room for observation. The doctor said the situation is not optimistic. My heart sank. Arthur, I took a deep breath, turned and walked towards the hospital. The night was as dark as ink, and the wind seemed to carry the fragrance of petals that fell from the jacaranda tree outside the wooden house 20 years ago. But the secret was eventually blown back by the wind. When I rushed to the hospital, the smell of disinfectant hit me in the face. Nurse Michelle stood at the door of the emergency room, her face full of fatigue and apology.
He's in a very bad condition, she whispered. The doctor said he could die at any time.
I didn't say anything, just nodded, and walked into the ward with heavy steps.
Arthur lay on the hospital bed, his face as pale as a piece of paper. The sound of the ventilator was regular and cold. His hands hung by the bed, clutching something. Michelle gently pulled his fingers apart, and a yellowed photo slipped from his palm. It was an old photo, with the edges curled slightly. The photo shows Arthur and Sean with a grove of jacaranda trees in the background. The sunlight shines through the branches and leaves onto the two of them, making them look warm and quiet. But I know that it is not an ordinary photo. That was the only photo taken after Rebecca's case, when Arthur took Sean to relax in the suburbs. Michelle looked at me and said in a hoarse voice, he said he had dreamed about that day many times. He said Sean cried that day, and that he pushed Rebecca. He also said, "I'm sorry." I looked down at the photo and felt a dull pain in my heart. 20 years ago, a father chose to remain silent in order to protect his son. 20 years later, a teacher used his last time to tell me the truth. I held the photo tightly and turned to leave the ward. The old site of the wooden house was covered with weeds, and the surroundings were eerily quiet. Emma stood beside me, holding a stack of documents. She said there were some contents in Rebecca's diary that had not been made public. "Do you really think there's anything else you can find?" she asked. I nodded and closed my eyes. A familiar scene comes to mind. That was the night of the crime. Candles were lit in the cabin, and a light fragrance filled the air. Rebecca sat at the table, flipping through an old photo album. The door was suddenly pushed open, and she looked up with a smile on her face. Then the smile froze. I saw a figure approaching. It's Edward. He was wearing a dark windbreaker, holding a jacaranda headband in his right hand, and slowly buttoning a silver cufflink with his left hand. The letters EC are engraved on the inside of the cufflinks. Rebecca looked at him in horror and tried to stand up, but he held her shoulders.
Why do you want to get involved in these things?
He whispered. You can just not do anything about it. The next second she fell down. I opened my eyes and cold sweat ran down my back. What's wrong with you? Emma noticed that something was wrong with me. I think I know how she died, I said. It wasn't strangulation. It wasn't stabbing. It was head-on impact, because he was holding her shoulders at that moment and pushing her to the ground. I squatted down and pointed at a sunken spot on the floor. There used to be blood here. Emma was stunned. How did you know? I didn't answer, just looked out the window. There the jacaranda trees still stand quietly, with their petals falling in the wind, as if nothing has changed. The next day, the news headlines were all about Sean Hawke being interviewed. He sat in front of the camera with a complicated expression and guilt in his eyes. My father protected me, but he also caused another innocent person to lose his future forever, he said. I didn't tell the truth back then, and it's a mistake I will never be able to forgive myself for in my life. The scene switches to him bowing deeply to the camera. I sat in the office, looking at the TV screen, feeling unusually calm. The phone rang. It was Captain Thompson. The closing hearing is scheduled for next Wednesday morning, he said. Will you come? Certainly. After hanging up the phone, I looked out the window. The jacaranda season is almost over. There is a faint sweet fragrance in the Melbourne wind. And on the day of the closing hearing, I walked into the conference room, wearing a dark suit. The sunlight filtered through the gaps in the blinds, casting fine shadows on the tabletop. Superintendent Thompson sat at one end of the long table, flipping through a thick file. He looked up at me, his tone calm but inquiring. Claire, how did you do it? How did you restore the truth of a nearly unsolvable case 20 years ago step by step in your hands? I smiled and said nothing. Tell me. His eyes fell on my face. We all want to know. I spoke slowly, my voice unhurried. I just remember every detail. These words fell in the quiet room, like a floating jacaranda petal, falling silently on everyone's heart. No one knows. And that's not just because I'm good at observation.
I didn't tell you the secret that had been hidden in my heart for many years, that I could see certain scenes as clearly as if I had experienced them myself.
Those tiny traces and vague fragments of memory were reorganized and pieced together in my mind, and eventually became the key to the truth. But these are not suitable for formal occasions. Rebecca left a diary. I continued. She wrote down many things, including her Uncle Edward's habits, and Emma is the only one who still has memories of that time. Without them, no matter how careful the reasoning is, it would be meaningless. Thompson pondered for a moment and nodded. You are right. Justice is not accomplished by one person, but the result of the persistence of countless people. By the time the meeting ended, it was almost dark. I walked out of the police station, and the night breeze blew across my cheeks, bringing a hint of coolness. I walked slowly along the street and finally stopped in a grove of jacaranda trees on the outskirts of Melbourne. The flowering period is coming to an end, and the petals are falling one after another, forming a silent path. I stood under the tree, looking down at the letter I had just received in my hand. The envelope was plain, with no signature or postmark. It just lay there quietly on my desk, as if it had never been touched by anyone. I opened the envelope and inside was a business card. There was nothing written on the front, but on the back was a sentence written in very small letters. Some cases are not over yet. I looked up into the distance, the corners of my mouth slightly raised, turned around and left, my steps as firm as before. I stood in the jacaranda grove, and the wind blew through the treetops, as if someone was whispering. The business card felt cold in my palm, and the words on the back seemed like a provocation or an unfinished invitation. After returning to the police station, I handed the mysterious business card to Emma. Have you seen this kind of ink? I put the business card on the table in front of her, and took a small step forward. Emma frowned at it, her fingertips gently rubbing the writing on the back. This doesn't look like ordinary printer ink. It's more like the marks left by the carbon ribbon of an old typewriter. She suddenly remembered something, took out Rebecca's diary, and flipped through the pages. Finally, it stopped on a line of blurred handwriting in the corner of one of the pages. Look at this. She pointed at a sentence blurred by the rain. Isn't it similar? Indeed, the edges of the strokes have a slightly diffused effect, as if they were written with an old-fashioned writing instrument. I immediately asked the technical department to take samples for testing, and the results confirmed that the ink composition of the two was exactly the same. This means that the person who wrote this business card has read Rebecca's diary. The purpose of doing this is either to provoke or to guide. The next morning, Emma and I went to the Melbourne City Library. Laura Smith was waiting for us. She was the key person in our successful access to the old archives. You were looking for Jacaranda Foundation, right? Nora said, flipping through old index cards. I recognized the name, but it's not a very common one. It's information from around 200. Nora nodded and pulled out a heavy-bound volume from the depths of the bookshelf, the annual index to the Melbourne Evening Post. She quickly found a brief news item. The Jacaranda Foundation has launched a youth mental health assistance project, which aims to subsidize 100 local students from poor families to receive psychological counseling services. The project will be officially implemented this month and will last for 1 year. Partners include the Municipal Children's Psychological Assistance Center and some private practitioners. The report mentioned at the end that the foundation was jointly initiated by several anonymous donors, and the person in charge was signed LF. Emma and I looked at each other. LF, short for Lisa Ferguson. I contacted Lisa that afternoon. She was a gentlewoman in her early 40s, wearing a low-key beige sweater, and always speaking with a soothing smile. I sat outside her clinic for 10 minutes before I mustered up the courage to knock on the door. Inspector Claire. She was a little surprised when she opened the door. Is it about Rebecca's case? I nodded and walked into her consultation room. There are several tranquil landscape paintings hanging on the walls, and the scent of lavender wafts in the air. She motioned for me to sit down and handed me a glass of warm water. I want to ask you if you have ever participated in a psychological assistance project called the Jacaranda Foundation. I stared into her eyes. She was stunned for a moment, then shook her head. I don't remember this project. I was silent for a few seconds, took out the copy of the receipt and placed it on the table. When she saw the seal and signature on it, her face suddenly changed. This is... She lowered her voice. The payee says LF, which looks like your initials. She finally stopped denying it and sighed. I did take on a short-term volunteer project. It was very short, and I only tutored one child. After that, the foundation lost contact. I thought it was just an ordinary charity attempt. Who is that child? I asked. She hesitated for a moment and whispered, "It's a girl, troubled by family problems." My heart skipped a beat. She didn't say the name, but I already knew the answer. That's Rebecca. It was dark when we left Lisa's clinic. There were few people on the street, and the wind blew up the fallen leaves, making rustling sounds underfoot. I looked down at the photo of the receipt and images suddenly popped up in my mind. Lisa had long fingers and neatly trimmed nails, and she habitually tilted her handwriting 15 degrees to the left when writing. The signature on the receipt, although imitating her style, had slight deviations in the angles of some of the strokes. This was not written by her. Someone forged this document. My temple began to throb and that familiar premonition resurfaced. The truth is far from over. I tightly gripped my phone, preparing to go back to the police station to check the flow of funds of the foundation that year, but I found that my hands were shaking slightly. I stood in front of Rebecca's grave. The night wind blew through the branches of the jacaranda trees, making a rustling sound like some kind of whisper. I spread the anonymous letter and the receipt out on the stone slab in front of the tombstone, shining coldly in the moonlight. I closed my eyes and ran my fingertips over the photocopy of the receipt.
Tessa Ferguson's signature, LF, has smooth strokes and beautiful handwriting, with a gentle temperament unique to a psychiatrist.
But the signature on the copy made me feel something was wrong from the beginning. Now I mobilized that familiar perception. It always emerges when I focus on observing details, like a compressed memory playback, or like the superposition of vision and intuition. I can see the angle and strength of the pen tip as it passes across the paper, and even the writer's habitual movements. The trace of that signature began to reappear in my mind. In the first stroke, the vertical line of the L is steady, but it shifts slightly to the right at the end, which does not match Lisa's hand gesture when writing. Her wrist is relaxed, and the end of her pen usually falls naturally, rather than as if controlled, as on this receipt. Next is the F, with clear horizontal lines, a slightly shorter horizontal line in the middle, and the last vertical line ending cleanly and neatly. When Lisa writes F, the second horizontal stroke is always slightly longer, and the last vertical stroke often has a slight curve. The F on this receipt looks more like a copy than her own natural writing. I opened my eyes and my heart beat faster, involuntarily. This was not written by Lisa. Someone forged her signature and forged the document. I slowly stood up and put the two documents into the mezzanine. My eyes fell on the already blurred name on the tombstone. Rebecca Carter, died in 2003. If this receipt was not signed by Lisa, it means that the Jacaranda Foundation was not a non-profit organization from the beginning. Its fate, or at least some of its workings, aren't real. I pulled out my phone, typed in a few keywords, and pulled up the Melbourne City Hall's non-public records request form. Tomorrow morning I will formally apply to review the original registration information of the Jacaranda Foundation, but just as I was about to leave, I suddenly caught a glimpse of something strange next to the tombstone. A letter lay quietly beside the tree roots. There was no seal or signature, only a piece of letter paper with a line of words on it. "You haven't found the key yet." I was stunned. Looking down at that sentence, my mind suddenly came to the landscape paintings on the wall of Lisa's clinic, and the angle of her wrist slightly tilted to the left when she wrote. At that moment I seemed to understand something. I looked back into the depths of the woods. The shadows of the trees were mottled, and it seemed as if a pair of eyes were quietly watching me in the darkness. But I'm not afraid anymore, because I know that the game has just begun. I barely slept a wink that night. At 6 in the morning, I stood at the door of the Archives Department of Melbourne Town Hall. The receptionist was a woman named Nora Smith, who wore gold-rimmed glasses and spoke slowly. She is an old acquaintance of mine in the internal archives of the police station. Knowing that I care deeply about the Jacaranda Foundation, she helped me retrieve the registration information early in the morning. "Claire." She looked at the result on the screen and frowned. "Are you sure this is the right name?" I nodded. "The Jacaranda Foundation, or BJ." She tapped the keyboard a few more times, switching between several databases, and finally looked up, with a hint of uneasiness in her tone. "Strange. There is no record of this organization in our system. There is no establishment time or cancellation information. It's like it appeared out of thin air." I felt a chill in my heart. This is not right. If Rebecca was really the recipient of funding from a foundation, there should at least be a registration number, bank account, tax records, and even activity records. But now, there is nothing. "Can you check the unofficial records again?" I asked. Laura was silent for a while, then nodded. "I can try the private channel." An hour later, she circled an address on a piece of printed paper. The former site of St. Irene's Church, North Melbourne. This was mentioned by chance by a non-governmental organization during a social survey in 2005. She pushed the paper to me. At the time, they wanted to contact the foundation to do a youth psychological counseling project, but found that the foundation no longer existed. I stared at the address and felt like a stone was pressing on my heart. That afternoon, I contacted Emma, and we drove to the North District. St. Irene's Church was built in the early 20th century and was used as an orphan shelter during World War II. It was then abandoned for many years. Now only the dilapidated outer wall and the half-collapsed bell tower remain, overgrown with weeds, and even the surrounding residents rarely approach. We went around to the backyard and climbed into the main building through a broken window. The air was filled with damp and moldy smells, and there were mottled jacaranda murals on the walls, as if someone had tried to make this place more cozy. Rebecca said in her diary that they always asked us to paint jacarandas. Emma whispered. We continued down to the basement. The stairs creaked, and the beams of flashlights wavered in the darkness. As soon as I stepped into the underground floor, I felt a sudden pain in my temple, and that familiar feeling began to emerge. Detailed memory enhancement. The world before my eyes seemed to be slowed down for a frame. The walls, the ground, and the dust in the air were all telling me about the past. I closed my eyes, and a blurry picture appeared in my mind. Several teenagers sat in a corner with dazed expressions. Boxes of supplies were piled against the wall, with labels saying BJF donation on them. A figure patrolled back and forth, always with his back to the camera, leaving only an outline, wearing a white coat, with a silver ring on the ring finger of his left hand. I opened my eyes, my breathing quickening. Did you see anything? Emma asked nervously. I nodded, my voice hoarse. This is not an ordinary charity. It's more like some kind of screening mechanism. We continued our search, but found nothing that could be used as evidence. The only valuable clue was a yellowed note with a line of words written on it. The key is hidden in the quietest place. I don't know what this means, but it reminds me of the letter next to the tombstone. You haven't found the key yet. That night I found Marcus Black. He lives in an old-style apartment in South Yarra, and looked surprised when I arrived. Are you here for that old story? He sighed. 10 years ago, I wrote an article about the mysterious disappearance of the Jacaranda Foundation. Later I received an anonymous letter with only 3 words in it. He pulled out a newspaper clipping and handed it to me. Shut up, leave, and forget. I stared at the words and felt a chill down my spine. I thought it was a prank at the time. He shook his head and smiled bitterly. But now that I think about it, maybe I really shouldn't have touched this matter. When I stood up to leave, he suddenly said, "Did you know that several children were missing at that time, and the authorities didn't report it?" I was stunned. Who? I can't remember the names, but they are all related to that foundation. I walked out of the apartment building and stood under the streetlight, my fingers tightly clenched around my notebook. This is no longer just Rebecca's case. It is a bigger secret that was planted 20 years ago, and now it is gradually coming to light. Back in the office, I was about to sort out today's clues when my cell phone suddenly vibrated. It was Lisa Ferguson's message. She said, "I want to talk to you about hypnotherapy tonight at 7 o'clock in my clinic." I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen for a long time. At that moment, I suddenly realized the key may be in her mind. But what I didn't know was that when I walked through that door, what would greet me was not a memory, but a carefully designed revelation of the truth, a conversation that has been long awaited. It was dark when I walked into Lisa's clinic. The lights in the house were dim, and there was a faint scent of lavender in the air. She sat on the old leather sofa, holding a yellowed folder in her hand, and her eyes were no longer as calm as when they first met. "You're here," she whispered. I didn't say anything, just sat down in the chair opposite her. "I've always wanted to tell you something." Her voice trembled a little, but I never dared. I stared into her eyes. It's not too late to tell her now. She took a deep breath and opened the folder. The first page is an assessment report dated April. The name column read, Rebecca Carter. "I've been working at the foundation for 3 years," she said, speaking slowly. "On the surface, I'm a psychological counselor, but in reality, I'm a screener. We don't help teenagers, but select those children with unstable mental states and complicated family backgrounds as experimental subjects." My throat felt dry. "Rebecca is the 7th child I've evaluated." Lisa's voice began to break. "She's smart, sensitive, and has a strong sense of empathy. But most importantly, she has an almost obsessive connection to Jacaranda. That's one of our target traits." "What goal?" I asked. She did not answer immediately, but turned to the next page, on which there was a handwritten note. "Recommendation to terminate follow-up. Subject has shown resistance and may interfere with the progress of the experiment." I could have written her off. Lisa bit her lip, but I still reported it. I thought they would leave her alone, but I was wrong. She looked up, tears welling up in her eyes. I should have noticed something was wrong. That foundation doesn't belong to any official organization. Their funding comes from a secret project called the Calvin Institute, which specializes in studying the plasticity of human memory. "You mean they're doing memory control experiments?" "Yes," she nodded. "And Rebecca is the one who is closest to success." Just then the phone rang. It was David Miller. "Claire, I found out where a sum of money was flowing," he said hurriedly. "It was transferred from Orion Investments and eventually ended up in the Neurological Research Fund of St. Irene's Mission Hospital. The person in charge is someone you should know, Dr. Calvin Roy." My heart was shocked. "He's been dead for 10 years, I said, "but the research he left behind is still going on." David paused. "And this fund is still operating to this day." I hung up the phone and looked at Lisa. "Do you remember Dr. Calvin's research direction?" She nodded, her eyes empty. "Memory implantation, emotional manipulation, behavioral guidance. He said that as long as you find the right method, you can make a person believe that they have done something that never happened." I stood up and felt like the world was spinning. This was not an isolated murder. This is a carefully designed system project. Do you still have the records from that year? I asked. She was silent for a few seconds, then opened the drawer behind her and took out a key. In my safe, she said. I have the complete file there. I took the key and my heart beat faster. When I walked out of the clinic, the night wind blew in my face, freezing cold. And what is hidden behind the next door? Maybe a memory that the entire city dares not face. I held the key Lisa gave me. My palms were sweaty. The night breeze blew over with the scent of jacaranda flowers, and it smelled like the scent that came from 20 years ago. Emma was already waiting at the door of the newspaper office. When she saw me, she immediately came over and asked, "How's it going?" "It's worse than we thought." I handed her the key. The safe is in the basement of Lisa's clinic. She didn't ask any more questions, just nodded and turned to contact the technical team to do a scan backup. We all know that this is not just evidence of a murder case, but involves the dark side of the entire memory manipulation experiment system. The next morning, Nora was already waiting for us at the door of the archives. She was carrying an old suitcase and looked pale. "Found it," she whispered. In a locked room at the bottom of the archives, there is an unfiled meeting minutes from April 2003, 3 months before Rebecca was murdered. I took the yellowed paper and flipped through it quickly until I saw the words, "Project Echo is progressing smoothly. Test subjects have entered a critical phase, and target signature matches." There is a line of small print below. "If behavior deviates from expected, terminate contact immediately and initiate clearance procedures." My throat tightened and I could barely speak. Echo, not a code name. It's Echo. They tested Rebecca as Echo. Emma gritted her teeth. "That means she is not the only one." Nora nodded. "I have found several similar records in other materials. They are all teenagers, and they all show extremely high perception and observation. But only her name appears in the official list of the Foundation." The three of us looked at each other, and the air seemed to freeze. This was not an accidental murder, but a planned elimination. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Emma and I were sitting in the newspaper's conference room, with the table covered with documents, photos, and tapes. The copy of the experimental log submitted by Lisa was placed in the center, and the sentence on the last page was circled in red marker. "If you can't control it, eliminate it completely." These words are like a knife, piercing one's heart. We decided to publish an in-depth report titled "Under the Jacaranda: Forgotten Echoes." The article detailed the secret collaboration between the Jacaranda Foundation and the long-disbanded Calvin Institute, pointing out that in the early 2000s, they secretly recruited highly sensitive teenagers to conduct memory implantation and behavior guidance experiments, trying to find a way to make humans fully accept fictional memories. Rebecca became the first target to be eliminated because she discovered the abnormal flow of funds in the Foundation's accounts. Once the article was published, it immediately took the internet by storm. The media rushed to reprint the story. The public was outraged, and the government began to investigate. While I was sorting out the materials, I found a meeting record that had never been noticed by anyone. It read, "Echo 1 has completed the cleanup process. Remaining samples remain under observation." This means Rebecca is not the last Echo. I stared at the line of words, my heart beating like a drum. In the evening, I went to visit Arthur. He was lying on the hospital bed, looking tired, but his eyes were clear. He hadn't said much since that day in the hospital when he confessed everything to Sean. I printed out the report and placed it by his bed. "You're right," I said. "This isn't an isolated case. She's just the beginning." Arthur looked at me, his lips trembling slightly, and finally he said only one sentence. "I'm sorry." I said nothing, just held his hand. He is too old and too tired. He has been chasing the truth all his life, but he didn't expect that he would become a part of the truth. When I walked out of the ward, it was dark at night, and the streets of Melbourne were still quiet. There was only the sound of wind blowing through the jacaranda trees, like someone was whispering. The next morning, Arthur died. The funeral was simple and solemn. I stood at the back of the crowd and watched Sean slowly move forward with the coffin. He was dressed in a black suit, his expression calm, yet heavier than ever. After the funeral, he came up to me and whispered, "My dad always said that the police are there to protect people." He paused, his eyes fell on my face, and his voice was slightly hoarse. "But now I know that sometimes we protect the wrong people." I didn't say anything, I just felt a dull pain in my chest. This moment, those echoes are still hiding somewhere, and I have just begun to search. I stood under the jacaranda tree. The sunlight filtered through its branches and leaves, casting mottled shadows on the ground. When the wind blows, the points of light seem to dance, as if returning to that evening 20 years ago. Rebecca stood here, looking at the fallen flowers all over the ground, and said that she liked the jacaranda the best because it falls quietly without disturbing anyone. But her death was not so peaceful. Sean's voice still echoed in his ears. "My dad always said that the police are there to protect people, but now I know that sometimes we protect the wrong people." I patted his shoulder gently and said nothing more. His eyes were empty when he said this, as if a part of himself had been taken away, but at least he was willing to speak. After Arthur's funeral, the entire police station fell into a subtle silence. No one mentioned the echo in the experimental log, and no one mentioned the explosive report under the jacaranda trees, the forgotten echo. It seemed as if everyone hoped that this matter would just die out, like a nightmare that would pass once one woke up. But I know this is just the beginning. That night, I reread all the information I had about the Jacaranda Foundation and the Calvin Institute. The meeting minutes provided by Nora, the psychological assessment files handed over by Lisa, the fragments of Rebecca's diary found by Emma, and the most core log record. "If you can't control it, eliminate it completely." This sentence lingers in my mind. I turned to the last page of the diary, and the line of words was still glaring. Continue to observe the remaining samples. There isn't just one echo. I stared at the computer screen for a long time, and finally called Lisa. She was silent for a few seconds on the other end of the phone, and then she whispered, "Claire, there are some things you'd better not delve into." "I already know that," I said calmly. "How many children did you screen? Was Echo just a code name or some kind of classification criteria?" She sighed, her voice tired. "This is not a case you can handle, Claire. I just need a name," I said. "A living name." There was a sound of shuffling papers on the other end of the line, followed by a longer silence. "There's one," she whispered finally. "Codename Echo 7. My heart skipped a beat, but she said no more. I know she has said too much. After I hung up the phone, I sat by the window holding a copy of the journal in my hand. The night wind blew in, and the pages of paper fluttered slightly, as if someone was quietly reading the secrets of the past. The next morning, I went into my office and filed all the information about Project Echo into a separate case file, titled Project Echo, Unresolved Case Tracking. I wrote the first note on the home page. Target set, Ni, Echo 1, confirmed dead. Echo 2 to Echo 6, no public information. Echo 7 code name exists. Identity unknown. I looked out the window and saw the shadows of the jacaranda trees swaying and the sun was shining brightly. I whispered to myself, I will keep going. Then he picked up his coat and walked towards the police car, knowing that the real investigation had just begun. That night, I stared at the computer screen until the early hours of the morning. The desk was filled with documents, the registration records of the Jacaranda Foundation, the financial statements of the Calvin Institute, and the Echo project mentioned in the journal. Meeting minutes provided by Nora show that the project frequently appeared in high-level discussions between 2003 and 2005, but no document mentioned specific research objects or goals. I called Lisa Ferguson. She answered quickly, but her tone was nervous. Claire, have you found out something new? I'm asking you something, I said, trying to sound calm. What is Echo? How many children did you screen? Was Rebecca the first? There was silence on the other end of the phone for a few seconds, followed by a low sigh. We didn't plan to call her Echo 1, she said, but she's the most special one. My heart skipped a beat. What's the meaning? She's the only one who has residual memory after the intervention. Lisa's voice was almost inaudible. The other children either cooperated or were completely blank. But she is different. She remembers too much. They said it's unstable and must be cleared. Who said that? The Foundation? Or the Institute? I don't know the name, she whispered back. But I can tell you one thing. She was on the list, numbered Echo 01. At least 6 other code names were used after that. But we don't know who they were, and their files have all been destroyed. Do you know the true purpose of Project Echo? No. She paused. But I can tell you one thing. If you really want to continue investigating, go find Irene Walker. She was a peripheral researcher of the project back then, but later suddenly resigned and lived in seclusion in the countryside. She knows more than any of us. The next morning, I went to the police archives room. Nora was sorting out a batch of newly transferred old municipal files. When she saw me come in, she nodded at me, and then took out a file from a pile of papers and handed it to me. You might be interested, she said. I opened it and saw that it was a medical record from a church hospital in 2004. The patient information column said unknown girl, about 16 years old, hospitalized for 2 months, and the diagnosis was vague, only mentioning brain intervention therapy and behavioral correction experiment. I turned to the last page and saw 2 words written on the discharge status, death. But strangely, there was no autopsy report or copy of the death certificate. I immediately looked up the timeline of Rebecca's case for comparison. Her body was found in the fall of 2003, and this record was dated the following spring. Could this be the second victim? I murmured. Nora nodded. I think so too. And this church hospital was one of the partners of the Calvin Institute back then. When I left with the file, I had already made up my mind. At 3 p.m., I drove to a country town in southwestern Victoria to find the former researcher, Erin Walker. Her house is hidden among a grove of jacaranda trees, old but neat. The doorbell rang for a long time before someone opened the door. I don't accept interviews. She stood at the door, looking alert. I handed her Rebecca's photo. Do you know her? Her look changed. After a moment, she took the photo, her hands trembling slightly, and whispered something I couldn't hear clearly. She said she shouldn't have woken up so early. They could have controlled it. I was stunned for a moment, and before I could ask her any more questions, she turned around and went into the house. I thought she was going to close the door, but a few minutes later she came out and put a vintage videotape in my hand. Don't check anymore, she whispered. Some people don't want you to know. After saying that, she slammed the door shut. I returned to the car with the videotape in my arms, and the words came to my mind. Continue to observe the remaining samples. More than one echo. There was more than one victim. I gripped the steering wheel and stepped on the accelerator. As the night deepened, I drove into downtown Melbourne and headed straight for the technical department of the police station. Daniel was still working overtime. When he saw the videotape in my hand, he raised his eyebrows and smiled. What era is this? Are you going to ask me to solve a case with a typewriter? Stop talking nonsense. I handed him the tape. Please help me convert it to digital format. The sooner the better. He shrugged, took the tape and inserted it into the player. The picture flickered and gradually became clear. On the screen there was a closed room, with walls painted light blue. There were a few chairs in the corner, and several teenagers were sitting there with dull expressions and empty eyes. The camera slowly pans across the table in front of them, which has paper and pens and an open journal on it. On the background wall, there is a pattern of a blooming jacaranda. Daniel and I looked at each other and said nothing. He knew this was no ordinary video. The room in the picture is very quiet, with only the deep male voice in the recording asking, "What's your name?" A thin girl slowly raised her head. Her eyes were unfocused and her lips moved. Her voice was as vague as if it came from underwater. Echo 02. No name. Daniel frowned. What on earth is this? A child psychology test. I didn't answer him because my eyes were attracted by another child. A little girl in a white dress who was drawing on paper with her head down. She painted a tree full of jacarandas, with a girl in a red dress lying under the tree. My heart beat faster. "Go back," I whispered. Daniel did so. The scene replayed, and the little girl's voice sounded, repeating a passage softly but clearly. He said he would take me to the beach to watch the jacarandas fall. But he changed that day. He was not himself anymore. His hand was a left-handed hand, but my uncle always ate with his right hand. I stood up suddenly, and the chair made a harsh sound on the ground. This is what Rebecca wrote in her diary. Exactly the same. Claire. Daniel was a little flustered. "What's wrong with you?" I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. This isn't an ordinary research project. They're copying her memories. You're saying that these people, he pointed at the screen, are imitating her experience. Or worse, I said. They're extracting, meddling, rewriting. Just then, footsteps were heard at the door. Sean Hawke stood there looking at the screen with a complicated expression. "Did you find this out?" he asked. I nodded. "What do you know?" He was silent for a few seconds before he spoke. "My father once mentioned a place, a church hospital. He said it was not a place to treat patients, but a place to deal with problems." I looked at him and suddenly realized something. "You were listening to us discussing Project Echo with Emma." He nodded and said, "I know someone who used to volunteer at that hospital. Maybe he knows something." I stared at him for a few seconds and then sighed softly. "Maybe your father is right. The police do serve to protect people." He didn't say anything, just nodded. The next morning, I received a message from Sean. I contacted him and he was willing to help. The name attached is Matthew Blake. Shortly after he responded, I received an anonymous email with a single PDF document attached. I clicked it and my heart beat faster. It was a copy of the church hospital's patient registration form for the spring of and on line 17 it clearly reads, "Unknown girl, age, approximately 16 years old, date of admission March 18, 2004, status of discharge dead." The number column has 2 letters, E0. I stood in front of the ruins of the old hospital, and the wind blew past with dust.
This used to be a church hospital, but now there is only an empty shell left with even the walls peeling off.
Erin stood beside me, clutching the PDF printout. Her expression was grim. "Claire, do you really think she might still be alive?" I didn't answer, but just glanced at the anonymous email on my phone. The sender can no longer be traced, but the content is too accurate. The number E02, like the Echo 01 we found in Rebecca's diary, comes from an experimental plan that we have not yet understood. Matthew, introduced by Sean, was already waiting for us at the door. He looked older than his profile indicated, but his eyes were steady. "I know what you're looking for," he said. "At least I know how to get to the basement. The main building of the hospital has been abandoned for many years, and the door lock has long been rusted." We went around to the back and climbed in through a broken window. The air was filled with damp and musty smells. There are some blurry graffiti on the wall, like lines drawn by children, crooked, messy and with a strange repetitiveness. Matthew led us through a deserted corridor, and finally stopped in front of an iron door. "No one has been here before," he whispered. "I was just a volunteer, but they wouldn't let us get close to this door." I squatted down to look at the door lock. It was an old-fashioned dial combination lock. Irene frowned. "What if I don't have the key?" I was about to speak when I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my temple, like a needle gently scratching my brain. This is my ability, enhanced memory of details. A picture emerged in front of my eyes. Someone was sitting in a wheelchair, pushing himself slowly. Another person was carrying a toolbox, squatting in front of the door to adjust the lock. He muttered numbers, 37, 512. I opened my eyes suddenly. Try 3. Irene was stunned for a moment, then did as she was told. With a click, the lock opened, the door creaked open, and a gust of cold air blew in. The stairs extended downwards, and darkness engulfed the end of the steps. We turned on the flashlights and walked down step by step. The basement is bigger than I thought. The walls were covered with yellow tiles, and the floor was littered with broken glass test tubes and old medical record folders. Irene squatted down and picked up a piece of paper, reading aloud. E04. Consciousness recovery failed. What kind of project is this? Before I could say anything, the image in my mind came back. A group of children sat in chairs with needles in their arms. Their eyes were dull and saliva was hanging from the corners of their mouths, as if they had been injected with some drugs. There was a photo on the wall. It was Rebecca. She remembers too much. It must be cleared. A voice whispered. I turned around suddenly and found Matthew standing against a wall, with his finger on an inconspicuous metal pull ring. This cabinet, I've seen it since I was a kid, he whispered. They hid things in it. We opened the cabinet door together. Inside was a locked iron box. I used the knife I carried with me to pry open the lock. The moment I opened the box, the air seemed to freeze. Several tapes were neatly arranged inside, each with a number on it. E01. There was also a note written in a scribbled hand. If you hear this, please tell them we haven't forgotten. Irene picked up the E01 tape and handed it to me. Are you sure you want to listen to it? I nodded. It was dark when we left the hospital, and I handed the tape to Lisa, the medical examiner's assistant. The office lights were dim, and Irene and I gathered around the player. I pressed the play button, and a discontinuous sound came out. I woke up, but I can't remember what happened. I held my breath. That voice was clear and familiar, as if emerging from the depths of memory. I remember that day. He was in the kitchen washing blood. He said he would take me to the beach to watch the jacarandas fall, but he was no longer himself. His hand was a left-handed hand, but my uncle always ate with his right hand. I froze. This is not a retelling. This is a real memory. After listening to this, Lisa was silent for a long time before she raised her head with a frown. Did a voice print comparison. The timbre, frequency, and intonation changes in this recording are exactly the same as the last few voice records of Rebecca before her death. This is not a forgery. I stared at the tape on the table, my heart pounding like a drum. Rebecca, maybe she's not really dead. But where did she go? Who turned her into echo? I stared at the E01 tape on the table, as if it would suddenly speak. Rebecca's voice slowly came out from the player, clear and real, even with a hint of hesitation and fear. I remember now. He was cleaning the blood in the kitchen. He said he would take me to the beach to watch the jacaranda flowers fall. Her tone didn't sound like she was reminiscing, but rather like she was piecing together a past that had been artificially erased. Lisa pushed the voice print comparison result in front of me, her eyes revealing uneasiness. Claire, I checked it 3 times. The timbre, intonation, and speed changes in this recording are exactly the same as the voice recording of Rebecca's last police interview. My heart was shocked, and I almost blurted out, then her death report could be false. This sentence was like a stone dropped into stagnant water, causing ripples. If Rebecca was not dead, then whose body was found in the cabin? I grabbed my phone and rushed back to the police archives room. The cold, white light of the night was blinding. My fingers almost trembled as I flipped through the pages of the autopsy report from 20 years ago. Finally, in a photo taken at the scene, I saw a detail that should not have been ignored. The DNA of the skin tissue remaining between Rebecca's fingernails did not match anyone. This is not an oversight, it is a deliberate concealment. I murmured under my breath. If she was just unconscious at the time, then who is the real corpse? It was dark outside the window, and the wind blew across the glass, making a low whimpering sound. It was 2 o'clock in the morning when I got back to the apartment. I made myself a cup of black coffee and tried to keep myself awake, but the recording kept replaying in my mind. He has a left-handed hand, but my uncle always eats with his right hand. This isn't just a fragment of memory, it's a key clue. Edward is right-handed, and that day he wore Sean's clothes and appeared disguised as Arthur's son. But Rebecca still remembered that detail before she fell into a coma, the movement of her left hand. This contradiction became the biggest breakthrough in the case. I turned on my computer and began to re-examine all the testimonies, transcripts and physical evidence. Every moment, every statement, every photo is re-examined. Gradually, an absurd yet amazing possibility emerged in my mind. Rebecca may really be dead, at least dead in the legal sense, but she herself may be hidden somewhere more hidden. What is Project Echo? The next morning, I met Irene at the police station door. Her face was pale and her lips were chapped, as if she had not slept all night. I handed her a cup of hot coffee and asked, "Did you say anything to Matthew?" She was stunned for a moment, then shook her head. "No, I just think that these things should have been revealed long ago." I looked into her eyes and asked, "Do you know something?" She lowered her head and was silent for a few seconds, then said softly, "There are some things. I'm not sure whether I should tell you." I was about to ask more, but she suddenly looked up at me and said in a soft but firm voice, "If you really want to know the whole truth, come to my house." I was stunned. "Now," she nodded, a wry smile forming on her lips. "There are some things that I have been hiding in the floor. I thought they would never be found, but now it seems that maybe it's time for you to see them." At that moment I realized that what she held in her hand might be the key to the whole thing. I drove behind Erin through the early morning mist in Melbourne. She drove very slowly, as if intentionally giving me time to think about something. I gripped the steering wheel tightly in the back seat. My palms were sweaty. From what she said last night, I knew this trip wouldn't be as simple as seeing what's in the mezzanine floor. Her apartment was in an old residential building, and the door lock was a little rusty. When I pushed the door open, a stale wood smell hit me in the face. Without turning on the light, Irene walked directly to a floor tile in the corner of the bedroom. She squatted down and pried open the floorboards with a knife. I squatted beside her and watched her pull out a black plastic bag from underneath her. Inside the bag was a leather notebook and a yellowed piece of paper. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handed me the paper. "This is the list of survivors of Project Echo," she said. 6 names. Rebecca is the first. I stared at the words, Rebecca Carter, status missing. My throat felt like it was blocked by something. Not because I was surprised, but because I had a sense of what was going to happen next. If she is missing rather than dead, that means she may still be alive. Irene whispered, "I was just a researcher at the time, but I found the list while working in the archives. I hid it because I didn't know what to do with it. Then the project was shut down and all the information was destroyed. I thought it would just rot underground until you started to reinvestigate Rebecca's case." I turned the paper over and saw a handwritten note on the back. Subject 06. Still has the risk of residual memory and requires continuous monitoring. I looked up at Erin. "Who is Echo Z?" She shook her head. "I don't know the specific information. I just remember that there was an anonymous experimental subject codenamed Echo 06. She was the only one who did not leave any identity records. She was mentioned in the tape." I immediately took out my cell phone and dialed Matthew's number. "Do you have any tapes you haven't listened to yet?" I asked. "There's another one, just found," he answered. "But I just listened to it. And there was a passage that didn't make sense to me. Echo 06 is still alive. They're looking for her. They can't let her talk. My breath hitched. Where are you now? It's at the bureau. I can transfer it to you right away. Less than 20 minutes later, I was sitting in front of the monitoring station in the police interrogation room, with the headphones pressed tightly to my ears. The recording was fuzzy and full of background noise, but the words Echo 06 is alive were eerily clear. I was about to take off my headphones when Sean suddenly walked in. "Let me hear it," he said. I was stunned for a moment, but still handed the headphones to him. After listening to it once, he frowned. "This is not ordinary background sound. There are bell sounds in this sound." We were all stunned. "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded. "I used to go to church as a kid and I remember the frequency of the bells. It was different from any church in Melbourne now. More like an old-fashioned suburban bell tower." He took out his mobile phone, opened a map application, and entered the keywords in the search bar. Melbourne Bell Tower Church Historical Building. After a while, his finger stopped at one spot. "Here," he said. "Santa Maria Monastery, in the western suburbs. It has been abandoned for more than 10 years, but the bell tower is still there." I immediately applied to track the source of the recording, and notified the technical department to conduct voice print comparison and frequency analysis. I myself, along with Matthew and Irene, prepared to go to the monastery for investigation. Before leaving, I looked back at the list of survivors on the table. Rebecca Carter. Names are listed at the top. Status: lost contact. And now, maybe she's just waiting for someone to come and get her back. The wind blew in from the window, carrying a little bit of damp, earthy smell. It is also to find out the deliberately buried memories behind the truth. When I arrived at the monastery of Santa Maria with Irene, Matthew and 2 technicians, the sun had already set, and the sky was like an old washed canvas, with a hint of cold light in the grey blue. The wind blew across the top of the abandoned bell tower, making a low whimpering sound. The gate of the monastery had long been rusted and corroded. It took us more than 10 minutes to pry open a gap that was barely big enough for someone to pass through. The air was filled with a mixture of musty and damp smells, as if this place had never been truly abandoned, but was merely blocked off by time. I led the way, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the mottled walls and broken benches. The altar was at the innermost part, covered with a thick layer of dust, like a relic that had been sleeping for decades. "Do you really think there's something here?" Matthew asked in a low voice. I didn't answer, but just moved closer to the altar step by step. Just as I stepped onto the last few steps, my eyes were suddenly caught by a strange bulge in the corner of the altar. The edges of the stone bricks there were shifted a little unnaturally, as if someone had moved them. I squatted down and gently scraped off the dust and moss on the surface with the knife I carried with me, revealing an inconspicuous crack. "Help me," I said. Matthew came over to help immediately and pried open the brick. There was a leather notebook hidden underneath. The cover had turned yellow, but it still had clear words written on it. Echo 0. My fingers trembled slightly. Opening the first page, the handwriting is sloppy but full of power. They thought they could turn me into a tool by controlling my memory, but they forgot that real memory will not disappear. It will lie dormant and quietly awaken one night. I continued reading, and each page felt like a monologue of a person struggling to survive. It records how she was experimented on, how she pretended to be submissive, and how she secretly recorded everything. She mentioned the promise under the jacaranda tree, Uncle's left hand, and mirror disguise. Until the last page there is only one short sentence. "She's not dead yet. She's waiting for someone to come find her." My heart almost stopped. Rebecca Carter, not dead. It was not a misjudgment or a misunderstanding. Someone deliberately let her die. I put the diary in the evidence bag and turned to Erin. "Do you remember the sound of echoes?" She nodded. "I remember a recording. Her voice is very special, like Someone who has been suppressed for a long time finally found an outlet. I closed my eyes and the name flashed through my mind. Edward. He did not want to kill to silence the witness, but to cover up a bigger secret. We returned to the police station overnight and handed the diary to the technical department for further analysis, and I sat at my desk staring at the screen in a daze. At 1:17 in the morning, an email alert suddenly popped up on the computer. I looked up and saw that the sender column was empty, with only a title, "I'm waiting for you." Attached is a blurry photo. In the photo, a figure is standing under a blooming jacaranda tree, wearing the clothes that Rebecca wore on the day she disappeared 20 years ago, with her back to the camera and her hair fluttering gently in the wind. I stood up so quickly that my fingers almost poked through the screen. This is not fake, because that tree in the background is the only jacaranda I saw near the monastery today. It was blooming abnormally and out of season. I immediately forwarded the email to the technician Daniel. "Check this IP address." He frowned and glanced at the photo. "This place looks familiar. Is it the ruins in the South District?" I didn't say anything. I just called Emma. "Do you have any other information about the Echo project? Or has anyone ever mentioned the promise under the jacaranda trees?" There was silence on the other end of the phone for a few seconds, and then Emma whispered, "Yes, that's Rebecca's memory before she was 7 years old. When she was a child, she always said that she had made an appointment with someone under the jacaranda tree, but she couldn't remember who it was." I held my phone tightly and looked out the window at the dark night. It turns out that the promise she made 20 years ago is still waiting for someone to fulfill it. At 1:17 in the morning, I stared at the email title on the screen. "I'm waiting for you." Attached to that email was a photo. The photo was blurry, as if it had been taken with a 20-year-old camera, but I immediately recognized the location of the jacaranda tree, which was near the monastery and the only tree that was abnormally blooming that I saw during my field research today. This is not fake. I immediately forwarded the anonymous email to our technician, Daniel, and said, "Check this IP address." He frowned and glanced at the photo, then suddenly said, "This place looks familiar. Is it the ruins in the South District?" My heart tightened, and I didn't say anything. I just dialed Emma's number. "Do you have any other information about the Echo project? Or has anyone ever mentioned the promise under the jacaranda trees?" There was silence on the other end of the phone for a few seconds, and then she whispered, "Yes, that's Rebecca's memory before she was 7 years old. When she was a child, she always said that she had made an appointment with someone under the jacaranda tree, but she couldn't remember who it was." I tightened my grip on the phone and looked out the window at the dark night. It turns out that the promise she made 20 years ago is still waiting for someone to fulfill it. It was 6 o'clock in the morning and it was still dark. Daniel sent a preliminary location analysis. The email was sent from near an abandoned nursing home in Melbourne South, an abandoned corner of an old city renovation project that almost no one has ever visited. I immediately called Emma, Sean, and Matthew. 10 minutes later, we met at the back door of the police station. "We may not be going to catch the murderer." I looked at them, but to find someone who shouldn't have died. We drove to the South District, and no one spoke along the way. When the car stopped outside the sanatorium, the sky was just turning gray, and the air was filled with the damp smell of rust. The building has been abandoned for many years. The exterior walls are mottled, and vines are entangled like snakes between the window frames. We tiptoed into the main building, our footsteps making slight creaking sounds on the floor. The door of the ward on the second floor was ajar. The moment the door was opened, a smell of decay hit me in the face. I stood at the door, my eyes sweeping over the broken glass and shattered bed frame on the floor, and suddenly I felt a sharp pain in my temple. My detail memory enhancement ability was activated. The images in front of my eyes began to overlap. A young girl was huddled in the corner, her hands tightly hugging her knees, her messy hair covering half of her face. There were tear marks in the corners of her eyes. Her lips were cracked, and she was mumbling something. On the wall, deep nail scratches formed a string of numbers. Echo. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened my eyes again, all illusions disappeared, but I could clearly hear the voice in my heart. You are not alone. I turned to the others and nodded. Someone has been here before. It won't be for long. Matthew was rummaging through a pile of broken cardboard boxes when he suddenly stepped on empty air. A corner of the entire floor collapsed and dust flew everywhere. Then we heard a slight sound of movement. It came from the ceiling mezzanine. Everyone drew their guns and pointed them in the direction of the sound. After a moment, a figure slowly crawled out from the shadows. It was a woman, about 30 years old, wearing a tattered gown. She looked alert, but her eyes were unusually clear. On her left wrist was a faded silver bracelet with 3 letters faintly engraved on it. Tissue. She stared at the diary in my hand, her lips trembling, and asked, "Are you the one she's waiting for?" I stared at the yellowed photo, my fingers trembling slightly. The photo shows 2 little girls sitting under a jacaranda tree. The one on the left with a bright smile is Rebecca, while the one on the right seems like someone has erased part of her memory with an eraser, and her outline is so blurred that it is almost unrecognizable. Lena stood in front of me, her eyes complicated and tired. This photo is the only evidence that I remember her. What exactly is Project Echo? I lowered my voice, trying to keep my tone steady. She sat down slowly and leaned against the corner, as if this dilapidated room could give her a sense of security. It's not a scientific research project, but an experiment of consciousness stripping. We were chosen because our brains are abnormally active, and our responses to perception, emotions, and memories are far beyond those of ordinary people. They say this is to treat mental illness, but in fact, they are looking for a way to copy one person's consciousness into another. My heart suddenly shook. You mean they want to create a memory inheritor? To be more precise, it's a personality transfer. Lena looked at me with a certain sadness in her eyes. They called it the Echo Project. The numbers are from E01 to E10, and I gritted my teeth. What about Rebecca? Is she involved? Lena was silent for a moment, then nodded slightly. She was involuntary. They didn't record her presence because she wasn't a test subject, but a target carrier. These words stabbed into my heart like a knife. She said one sentence. Lena whispered, in a drug-induced state of unconsciousness. She said, "I'm not dead yet, but I can't wake up." And then, she was taken away. I could hardly hear the sound of my own heartbeat, and I felt that the whole world was quiet at this moment. "Who took her away?" I almost shouted. Lena raised her head. Her eyes fell on the diary in my hand, and whispered, "I don't know where they took her, but I know one thing. She is not dead, but trapped somewhere." Her eyes suddenly became empty. They call it the White Tower. I was stunned. The White Tower? Have you seen that place? I didn't. She shook her head, but I heard its name in my dream. It was one of Rebecca's last fragments of memory. The air seemed to freeze. I looked down at the photo, and when I looked up again, Lena was staring at the old watch on my wrist. It was a souvenir from my internship given to me by Arthur. There was a line of small words engraved on the back. "The truth doesn't speak for itself." I took a deep breath, put the photo away, and held out my hand to her. "You can't hide it any longer. I will arrange for you to undergo hypnosis treatment to see if you can remember more information about the White Tower." She hesitated for a moment, and finally held my hand. Her fingertips were cold. At that moment I suddenly realized a terrible fact. Rebecca did not die that night 20 years ago. She just disappeared. And this murder may just be the beginning of the whole thing. Over. I arranged for Lena to have hypnosis treatment that afternoon. Her whole body was like a taut string. Her eyes were wandering and her palms were cold. But after entering the hypnotic state, she became unusually calm. "Relax. You are safe." I guided her softly, and Erin Walker sat beside her and recorded her physiological reactions and verbal details. Lena closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then spoke slowly. I'm walking a long corridor with mirrors on both sides. It's not me in the mirror. Irene frowned. Not you? What was it? It was someone else's face. They were all looking at me. Their lips were moving, but no sound could be heard. I continued to guide. Where do you want to go? White Tower, she blurted out. My heart skipped a beat. Can you see it? I asked. Lena's fingers began to draw something on the table unconsciously. Nora immediately pushed a blank paper over. Lena didn't open her eyes. The tip of the pen slid as if controlled, and finally stopped on a clearly outlined figure, a 3-story circular building, like some kind of old watchtower, surrounded by a vague jacaranda forest. She mentioned jacarandas, Nora whispered. Rebecca's diary mentioned that when she was a child, she often went to her uncle's house in the suburbs, and the yard was full of jacarandas. I stared at the picture, my throat dry. This is not an ordinary memory fragment. This is location information. After the hypnosis ended, Lena leaned back in her chair tiredly, as if she had just experienced a long escape. I didn't disturb her, but turned away and went to find Nora with the picture. Nora is good at digging out old files, especially those that have been hidden for a long time. We returned to the police archives, and she spent 3 hours searching through the old account books of the Mission Hospital, finally finding a suspicious record of engineering grants. Construction of Bita Rehabilitation Center. I read out the title. It was in the spring of 2003. Nora pointed to the date at the bottom of the form. It was around the time Rebecca disappeared. My heart was shocked. This can't be a coincidence, I said. How could a rehabilitation center that nobody has ever heard of and hasn't been put into use actually receive a large amount of funding? And there's no record of the project information at all. Nora nodded. Unless it is not a project announced to the public at all. I picked up the picture that Lena had drawn and placed it side by side with the grant record. The more I looked at it, the more I felt something was wrong. That evening, I tracked down Erin Walker, a former researcher at the Calvin Institute who had worked on a number of neuroscience projects. When I handed her the drawing, her eyes changed. This is not a rehabilitation center, she whispered. This is a deep memory reconstruction, experimental base. How do you know? I asked. Because I was in one of the design meetings. She sighed. At the time we thought it was just a new way to treat mental illness, but it turned out that their goal was much more than that. Who is in charge? I stared at her. She hesitated for a moment before saying the name Mr. Who. I frowned. He was the deputy director of the Calvin Institute at the time, codenamed Mr. M. His real name is still unknown, but he led the entire ECHO project, and even personally supervised the progress of the experiment. Is he still alive? I asked. Irene nodded. Not only alive, but active in the medical community. He never really left. I felt my blood flowing backwards in my body. This case has long gone beyond my initial understanding, and the White Tower may be just the tip of the iceberg of the entire conspiracy. The next morning, I went to a private security company near the Calvin Institute with Lena's drawings, copies of grant records, and key information provided by Irene. The company is called Gray Defense, and its owner is Raymond Gray, the former security captain of the Institute. After the security guard informed me, I was taken to an office. He sat behind his desk, his back to the morning light outside the window, his face full of wrinkles carved by time. He looked at me in silence for a few seconds, then said calmly, "You are here to cause trouble. I'm here to find the truth." I spread the documents in front of him. About Echo 06, about Rebecca, about White Tower. He glanced at it, frowning slightly, but not showing any surprise. "How much do you know already?" he asked. I didn't answer, just looked at him quietly. He lowered his head and thought for a moment. then suddenly reached out and picked up the drawing I had placed on the table, gently stroking the edge with his fingertips. Then he raised his head, his eyes fell on the ID on my chest, and said in a complicated tone, "I thought you guys would never come." The air seemed to freeze. I nodded. "She's still alive," he whispered, as if afraid of disturbing something sleeping. "I thought you would never come." "What do you mean?" I asked. He picked up Lena's photo, stroking the edge with his fingertips, and a trace of emotion that I couldn't understand appeared in his eyes. "I met Rebecca when I was the security captain of the Calvin Institute. The last time I saw her was in the corridor of Area B of the White Tower. She was taken in by two people and never came out again." I held my breath. "That wasn't a rehabilitation center," he continued. "It was an experimental facility. They held people there for what they called memory resets. Rebecca was fighting back fiercely. I remember it clearly. She was wearing a jacaranda headband on her wrist. It was a very special color, like it was stained with blood." "Why didn't you call the police?" I couldn't help but ask. He smiled bitterly. "You think I haven't tried?" But when I was about to report it, the Institute suddenly cleared all the files, and the employees involved in the project were also dealt with. My deputy had a car accident on the way home, and I realized that things were not simple. Later, I was forced to resign and disappeared. After he said this, he took out a yellowed map from the drawer and gently pushed it in front of me.
"This is the structural diagram of the White Tower," he said. "I copied it secretly. It is not just a 3-story building, but also has 2 underground floors, all of which are enclosed spaces."
I looked down at the picture, my heart pounding. Several key rooms are clearly marked on the map: memory isolation room, consciousness projection cabin, and echo console. "Rebecca might be down there," I murmured. Raymond looked at me and suddenly asked, "Do you know what Project Echo really wants to do?" I shook my head. He looked at me deeply. "They are not curing mental illness, nor are they reshaping memories. They are trying to replicate consciousness and create echoes." "I don't understand," he explained. "It is to allow a person's memories and personality to continue in another body. Rebecca is not the only target. She is one of the earliest samples." I just felt a chill running up my spine. "Where's Lena?" I asked. "She was the last one to survive." He paused and added, "She is also the only echoes." I didn't say anything, but just carefully put the map away. Before leaving, I went back to Lena, squatted down, and held her hand. "I'll bring back both your name and hers." She nodded, her voice as soft as the wind. "Please tell her that I still remember her." I stood up, turned and walked out the door without looking back. At night, I sat in my office and compared the maps Raymond had given me with the satellite images. As expected, the area where the White Tower was located has been rebuilt and turned into a private sanatorium, the Weasel Sanatorium, shining on the surface, but hiding dark secrets on the inside. I opened the map and circled the most likely underground entrance with a red pen. Then I closed the folder and made a phone call. "Gather at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We will go to the White Tower." I stood in front of the main entrance of the sanatorium, and the wind was blowing a little hard. The sign of the Visser Sanatorium glowed with a soft blue light in the night, like a modern temple, clean and solemn on the outside, but full of filth and dirt. "We only have one chance." Emma and Lena stayed in the car outside, and I took Raymond and 2 trusted technicians, dressed in uniforms disguised as a health inspection team, and walked in with a swagger. "All the documents are in place." The receptionist smiled and nodded, handing over the visitor registration form. "Excuse me, are you the city's new medical compliance assessment team?"
That's right.
I took the pen and filled in a name at random. "Let's check your psychiatric medication records." She didn't ask any more questions and just arranged for a young nurse to take us in. As we walked through the hallway, I scanned the walls, the floor tiles, the vents. Those tiny traces automatically magnified in my mind. An unnatural wall crack, a floor tile that is cleaner than other areas, or even the angle deviation of a lamp. These are not coincidences. Turn left, I whispered around the corner. What did you say? The nurse looked at me puzzled. Go to the bathroom, I said as a matter of course. She hesitated for a moment and led us into another corridor. There were a few closed doors, and it didn't look like a public area. I leaned against the wall, pretending to check my phone, but in reality I was constructing a mental diagram of the corridor. Raymond's map matched the details I had observed perfectly. Isolation observation room. I looked at the iron door at the end with a high-voltage electricity warning on it. Raymond's expression changed instantly. Behind this door was the sample of the out-of-control echo that was locked up back then. His voice trembled. I remember someone screaming inside for 3 whole days. I didn't say anything but took out the toolkit and quickly pried open the door lock. The door creaked open, and a damp, musty smell hit me in the face. The room was pitch black, with only a faint red light coming from an old instrument in the corner. The heart rate monitor was still running. A green heart rate curve was dancing on the screen. Someone is still alive, I whispered. Raymond trembled as he approached, reaching out and touching the device casing. This model was discontinued at least 20 years ago. I walked around to the back of the screen and saw a body wrapped in a transparent film, connected to various tubes. The face was blurry, but I could vaguely tell it was a female. The information Lena provided came to mind. Echo 06. The last surviving Echo. Who is this? The technician asked in a low voice. I stared at the face and had a strong feeling in my heart. Rebecca Carter, I said. There was silence in the room. We continued to go deeper and came to a dusty archive room. This place seems like a forgotten corner, with papers piled up all over the room and the air filled with the smell of stale ink. I searched for a while and found a black notebook with no logo on the cover. Encrypted log. I touched the raised dot on the spine. A password is required. I immediately contacted Lena, who listened to me, was silent for a few seconds, and then whispered, "Try Jacaranda." That was a high-frequency word in Rebecca's diary, and it was also her birthday. After entering the password, the lock popped open, and I opened the first page with my palms slightly sweaty. Experiment number, test subject, Rebecca Carter. Intervention method, memory reset, neural synchronization projection. Target personality template, deceased biological sister Emma, 7 years old. The more I watched, the more shocked I became. Rather than healing Rebecca's trauma, they attempt to erase her original personality and reshape her into another one, a more controllable version. The last page reads, "The ultimate goal of the Echo Reconstruction Project is to create completely obedient memory individuals who can replace high-value targets in the real world at any time and complete secret missions. Rebecca is the first successful case. If there are no abnormal reactions in the future, the Echo 01 restart program will be initiated." I closed the journal, my heart beating faster. This is not an ordinary murder case, nor is it a simple family feud. This is a systematic conspiracy involving power, medical ethics, and even social engineering of identity replacement. We need to take this information away, I said to the technician. He nodded and started taking pictures for the record. Just as we were about to leave, Raymond suddenly said, "Wait, did you see the letter?" I followed his gaze and saw a sticky note at the bottom of the folder slip to the ground. The letter on the top of the letter read, "To Mr." The signature column was blank, but there was a consent form for surgery on the attachment page. In the signatory column, there was a familiar name, Edward Carter. I clenched the paper, my throat dry. Everything finally connected. He is not only Rebecca's uncle, not only the murderer, but also the core funder of the entire Echo project. And this letter is the last piece of the puzzle leading to the truth. "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, I whispered, "we'll make another trip." Raymond looked at me with fear and determination in his eyes. "Don't let him escape again this time," I stood in the corner of the archive room, my fingers still on the surgery consent form. The paper was cold, like a piece of iron stuck to my palm. Emma, take a look at this. I handed her the document. She took it, glanced over quickly, and her face turned pale instantly. This was signed by Deadwood. Her voice trembled. Not only did he kill Rebecca, but he also participated in the Echo plan. I nodded, my throat dry. He's not just a participant, he's a funder. Raymond frowned and whispered, I have always suspected that there is a financial sponsor behind the sanatorium, but I didn't expect it to be Edward. What exactly does he want to do? I took a deep breath and looked through the data records on my phone. The experimental logs we had just taken, the personnel lists, the fund flow charts, all pointed to one word, Echo 01 Restart Program. This is not a simple memory repair or psychological intervention, I said slowly. They are trying to rebuild a personality, completely reshape consciousness, and use it to replace real people. Rebecca is not a victim, but their earliest successful case. There was an extremely oppressive silence in the air. There were slight footsteps outside the door. Someone is coming, the technician reminded in a low voice. I immediately turned off the flashlight, stuffed the information into my backpack, and signaled everyone to hide. But in the next second, the whole room suddenly fell into darkness and all the lighting systems turned off at the same time. Then, the radio sounded. A deep male voice came from above the ceiling. You shouldn't be here. A chill ran down my spine. The lights were off, but the outline of the doorway gradually became clearer. The man, wearing a well-tailored black suit, walked slowly into the house with a steady and confident pace, as if he had already expected us to appear here. Malcolm Fisher. I whispered the name, feeling a strong sense of unease rising in my heart. He took a few steps closer and stopped less than 2 meters away from me, with a weird smile on his face. Claire Morgan. He pronounced my name as if he was evaluating an old friend he hadn't seen for a long time. You are indeed much smarter than others. It's not easy to get to this point. I subconsciously took a half step back and reached for the holster on my waist, but I found that his eyes didn't stay on me for too long. He raised a hand, holding a silver object in his palm. It was a silver cufflink. It is almost exactly the same as the one we dug out in the cemetery. Do you think you have found the murderer? He gently stroked the edge of his cufflinks, his tone frighteningly calm. Do you think you are uncovering the truth? No, Claire. He slowly raised his eyes and looked directly at me. You just triggered the restart. I gripped the gun handle tightly, and my palms felt wet. Where's Rebecca? My voice sounded colder than I thought. Malcolm Fisher smiled. The smile seemed to seep out slowly from the darkness, with an unsettling calmness. He didn't answer me, but gently stroked the silver cufflink, as if it was not an ordinary metal ornament, but a sealed memory. The key, he whispered, is also the lock. I narrowed my eyes. His tone gave me a chill, like some elaborate trap had finally been tightened.
You think you found the murderer?
He repeated, but this time with a hint of sarcasm in his tone.
No, Claire. You just triggered the restart.
The radio was still on, and the low sound of electricity was like a background sound, setting off the eerie atmosphere of this underground space. Raymond moved behind me. His steps were very light, almost moving to the right along the wall. I knew what he was doing, using his familiarity with the building's old systems to find the ventilation duct leading to the isolated observation room. He used to be the security captain here and was familiar with these passages. I nodded in response, not taking my eyes off Malcolm. What do you mean by restart? I asked quietly, adjusting my position to protect Lena and Emma behind me. The cufflink you dug out was just part of the plan. Malcolm slowly raised his eyes and looked directly at me. It was buried there to be found, to lead you here. What exactly do you want to do? Emma's voice trembled a little, but she still asked through gritted teeth. Malcolm did not answer immediately, but gently placed the cufflinks on the table, as gently as if they were a sacred object. "We are trying to rebuild a personality." He finally said this, his tone so calm that it didn't sound like he was talking about a terrible experiment, but rather a story, using memory, trauma, suggestion, reconstruction, erasing the original self bit by bit, and then implanting a new consciousness. This is the core of the Echo Project. I took an unconscious step back. "Rebecca is not a victim," he continued. "She is the first success story." My breath hitched. At this moment, Lena suddenly knelt on the ground, covered her ears, and growled, "Stop talking. Those voices are coming again." She trembled violently, pulled out a microchip from her collar, and threw it to Emma. "They installed this for me," he said. "It would make me obedient." Emma caught the chip and her face turned pale instantly. "Physical evidence of a control system," she whispered, her eyes lighting up. I made a quick decision. "Raymond, act now." Raymond immediately approached Malcolm from the side and rear, trying to distract him. I took advantage of the darkness and moved quickly to the left, aiming for the ventilation vent leading to the isolated observation room, the only place where we could get close to the truth. Malcolm seemed to have noticed something. He tilted his head slightly to look in the direction of the vent, and a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. "Do you think you can escape? You can't even tell whether what you saw is true or false." I ignored him and kept going. The lights in the room still hadn't come back on. Only the faint sound of electricity from the overhead radio and Malcolm's meaningful restart kept echoing in my mind. I squatted down, touched the screw of the vent, and unscrewed it inch by inch with my fingers. There were slight sounds of struggle coming from Raymond's side, and Lena's intermittent sobbing. I held my breath, lifted the ventilation grill, and crawled into the narrow ventilation duct. It was pitch dark inside, and the air was damp and cold. I crawled forward little by little, and besides my own heartbeat, there was a faint sound coming from my ears. Not a radio broadcast, not a human voice. It is a subtle whisper, like one echoing from deep within one's memory. Just as I was about to reach the end, a light suddenly flashed before my eyes. At that moment, I saw it. The picture, as clear as if it happened yesterday. A girl standing under a jacaranda tree, her skirt fluttering in the wind, her smile as beautiful as a flower. Her hair was tied with a blue ribbon, which was gently tied by a slender hand. That hand is the left hand. I suddenly woke up. This is not an illusion. It is the awakening of my golden finger ability. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, all the details in my vision began to magnify. The scratches on the floor, the blurred numbers on the wall, and the faint sound of instruments running outside the vent. Then I saw her. Rebecca was lying in an enclosed life support chamber with multiple wires connected to her head. I held my breath. "You are here after all," I murmured. And the next second, the red light above the hatch suddenly lit up. The alarm sounded suddenly in the darkness. I held my breath and gently slid my fingertips along the edge of the life support module. The coolness of metal came from the fingertips and the sleeping body in front of me. Rebecca Carter, the dead 20 years ago, was lying here quietly at this moment, as if she had just had a long dream. The brainwave map flashed on the screen, and the green curve rose and fell faintly, indicating that she was in a state of shallow consciousness. My detail memory enhancement ability was fully awakened at this time. Every line and every scratch in my field of vision seemed to be magnified tenfold. I could even see a yellowed label on the outer wall of the cabin, Echo 01, waiting to be awakened. My heartbeat suddenly stopped. This is not a murder case. It is the beginning of an experiment in artificial personality. Rebecca did not die, but was systematically reset. Her memory, personality, behavior patterns, everything is reconstructed and reshaped here, becoming part of some kind of plan. And that silver cufflink is just the key that led us here. I quickly pulled out my pocket knife, and cut a few non-critical wires, trying to cause the system to fall into partial chaos. Rebecca's ECG monitor suddenly gave off a sharp alarm and the red indicator light began flashing. Malcolm must have noticed something wrong. I whispered to myself, quickly scanning the interfaces and numbers on the control panel.
Sure enough, his voice came from the intercom, deep and with a hint of laughter. "Claire, do you really think you can take Echo 01 away?"
Then a piercing electronic countdown sounded on the radio. System self-destruct program activated. Remaining time, 9 minutes and 58 seconds. Emma, I immediately pressed the intercom button. Insert the chip into the main control terminal now. Understood. Her voice was nervous but firm. A few seconds later, the lights in the isolation room flickered violently, and all equipment was briefly out of order. At this moment, the hatch lock popped open automatically. Rebecca's heart rate suddenly increased, as if she sensed something. I immediately rushed over and peeled off the wires on her head as carefully as possible, while looking up to check her facial reaction. Her eyelids trembled slightly, as if she was about to open, but she seemed to be struggling in some deep dream. At that moment, I saw the light in her eyes, that long-lost human emotion, like a flame trapped in an ice world, finally breaking through a crack. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. I quickly pulled my notebook out of my pocket, opened it to a blank page, and whispered, "Rebecca, if you remember anything, write it down." Her empty eyes slowly focused on my face, and her fingers twitched slightly, as if trying to grab a pen, and I held my breath, waiting for her to write the first line, because I know that will be the most authentic testimony of the entire Echo project. I held my breath and watched Rebecca's fingers slide slowly across the paper. Her movements were very slow, as if she was emerging from a very deep bottom of water. I held her cold wrist tightly to prevent her from cutting the paper. Her eyes were still empty, but with a strange focus, as if she was being pulled by something back to the world she had long forgotten. The pen finally fell. It was a left hand, with long fingers and a slender wrist. Next came the cuffs. A flash of silver light. A cufflink was fastened. The movements were smooth, as if she had repeated this scene countless times. My heart skipped a beat. This was the last image the man in the windbreaker left for her, under the jacaranda tree, 20 years ago. Rebecca's fingertips suddenly trembled, and the tip of the pen poked heavily into the paper, leaving a dot in the lower right corner of the picture. Then her hand fell down weakly, as if she had exhausted her last bit of strength. "She drew a left-handed person," I whispered, my throat dry. This is exactly consistent with Emma's testimony back then. Edward Carter was left-handed. But in the case that year, Sean Hawke was identified based on the marks left on his right hand. I suddenly looked up at Rebecca's face. Her eyelids were half closed. Her breathing was weak, but her lips were opening and closing gently again. This time, I got closer. "Uncle, Mr. M," she uttered these two words intermittently, her voice as light as ashes drifting in the wind. My fingers almost dug into my palms. "Mr. Mum." I immediately turned on the recorder and put it close to her lips. "Did you say Malcolm?" She didn't respond and fell into unconsciousness. I quickly saved the recording and pressed the intercom at the same time.
Emma, did you hear that?
She mentioned Mr. M. It should be Malcolm. Check his registered identity at the nursing home. He must have a fake identity to cover it up. Got it. Emma's voice was full of excitement. Just then, there were hurried footsteps and the sound of metal collision coming from outside the door. It was Sean who came with the support team. They were wearing casual clothes, but everyone's eyes showed well-trained alertness. Sean rushed to the front and his face suddenly darkened when he saw me and the unconscious Rebecca in the cabin. "She's still alive?" He almost rushed over. I nodded. "I just regained consciousness and wrote down key information, but my physical condition is extremely unstable and I must be transferred immediately." He immediately signaled the medical staff behind him to come closer and carefully lifted Rebecca onto the stretcher. I followed them out, and handed the picture Rebecca had drawn to Sean as I walked. Left-handed, cufflinks. This is direct evidence that can overturn the miscarriage of justice. Sean took the paper, looked at the lines on it with complicated eyes, and didn't speak for a long time. We walked through a narrow corridor into the underground garage and prepared to board the ambulance. Just then, there was a commotion in the distant stairwell. Over there. Someone ran away. A team member shouted. I turned my head sharply and saw a figure in white work clothes moving quickly towards the side door. Malcolm, I growled through gritted teeth. Sean didn't say a word, drew his gun and chased after him. I followed him, my heart beating like a drum. We rushed out the back door. It was dark outside and the cold wind was blowing in our faces. Just when we were about to catch up with that man, he suddenly stopped, turned around to face us, with a sneer on his lips. Do you think this is the end? He whispered. The next second he ripped open the chest of his suit, revealing an ID tucked into an inner pocket. The man in the photo is not him, but a scientist who has long passed away. Sean sneered and raised his gun. You can even forge your identity. Do you really think we can't find you? The man had a sinister look in his eyes, and suddenly stepped back and disappeared into the darkness. But we all know that he has nowhere to run. Minutes later, I was standing in the ambulance, watching the paramedics give Rebecca emergency care, and those two words were still ringing in my mind. Uncle, Mr. M. Mr. M. Malcolm, who is this manipulator behind the scenes? I looked down at the recorder in my hand, pressed the play button, and confirmed the content of Rebecca's testimony again. Suddenly, Nora's voice came from the intercom, with a hint of hesitation. Claire, I just cracked an encrypted email in the system. It mentioned a follow-up plan codenamed memory grafting. I was stunned for a moment. Follow-up plan? What do you mean? Nora was silent for a few seconds, and her tone was serious. What it may mean is, Rebecca is not the only echo. I stood at the door of the isolation room, with the warmth of Rebecca's palm still lingering in my palm. She had just regained consciousness for less than 10 minutes, but it felt like all her life's memories had been exhausted. When Nora's voice came from the intercom, I was looking down at the sketch she had drawn in my hand. The left hand, the silver cufflinks, and the name Mr. Ram. Claire. Nora lowered her voice. I just cracked an encrypted email. It came from an internal file called Project Echo. I frowned and said, Go on. This email was sent 3 months ago, and was signed by Malcolm. It mentioned a follow-up plan, codenamed memory grafting. She paused, a hint of uneasiness in her tone. The goal is to transplant Rebecca Carter's consciousness into another test subject. My blood instantly ran cold. This is not just a murder case. This was a criminal network of human experiments that lasted for 20 years. You mean they planned to use Rebecca's consciousness as a carrier? I clenched my fists, digging my nails into my palms. It's not just a carrier, but a template, Nora whispered. They are looking for a suitable target to replicate consciousness. Rebecca is not the end, but the beginning. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. Did you find the recipient's profile? There is only one code name, Test Subject 02. The identity information is completely encrypted, but I am sure that this person is in Melbourne and has some connection with the case that year. I stared at the picture in front of me, and suddenly the details Emma had mentioned flashed through my mind. Rebecca wrote in her diary that her uncle Edward had taken her to see a psychiatrist to treat her nightmares. I've asked Emma to look up the doctor's name. Now it seems that it might not be an ordinary diagnosis and treatment. I quickly turned around and returned to the isolation room. Rebecca has been moved away, but her biological samples and brain recording data remain in the cabinet. I opened the drawer and pulled out the sealed evidence bag. These are not just evidence. They are living accusations. I gently held Rebecca's hand before leaving. You've waited so long, now it's our turn to get justice for you. Her fingers moved slightly, as if in response. I turned away and walked towards the waiting car. Sean was already waiting in the car, looking serious. "Did you see Malcolm's expression just now?" he said. "He's not afraid of being caught. He's afraid of us finding out." I nodded and put the evidence bag in my hand into the special box. "This is not a manhunt, but a reckoning," I said. "We are not facing a murderer, but a system hiding in the dark." Sean was silent for a moment, and finally spoke. "My dad always said that justice may be late, but never absent. But this time, I looked out the window at the brightening sky. We have to make it faster." After returning to the police station, I immediately uploaded all the data to the forensic laboratory and arranged for experts to analyze Rebecca's brain scan images. At the same time, I also organized the recording into a written report, marking the key information. But I also know that this is just the beginning. As I walked out of the tech room, my phone vibrated. Here is Nora's message. "Claire, I found a strange folder titled Countdown to Judgment Day." I stared at the screen and my heart beat faster and faster. "Tomorrow in court I will present for the first time Rebecca's brain scans, the life support chamber footage, and the evidence that Malcolm forged his identity. I don't know what kind of storm all this will bring, but I know that some lies cannot survive the trial of truth." I sat in the witness stand, looking out at the silent courtroom. The judge had already announced a suspension of the trial, and the 3 words "Echo Project" were like a bomb, blowing a crack in the entire judicial system. Rebecca's brain scan image was projected onto the big screen. It was not an ordinary neural map, but the memory corridor that had been dormant for her for 20 years. There are high-frequency reaction points in specific areas of her brain, and each signal is highly consistent with her experience on the night of the incident. We brought in an expert to interpret the data. She remembered not just blurry images, but sounds, smells, even the tone of a sentence. "Don't be afraid, it's me," I read from the recording. These are the first words the killer said as he approached. There was a low gasp from the gallery. Next played was the first video clip of her regaining consciousness in the life support chamber. She opened her eyes, her gaze was blank, her lips trembled slightly, and she kept murmuring a name. "Edward. Uncle." Malcolm sat in the dock, expressionless. But I had something far more deadly in my hands. His record of forged identity. He is not the head of the Free Psychological Research Association, but a core member of a secret project team. The name of that project is Echo. Technicians at the forensic laboratory extracted a complete experimental log from the encrypted hard drive he carried with him, which detailed his various attempts to rewrite memories, suppress emotions, and control behavior on his victims. Every page was written in cold, scientific jargon, as if they were dealing not with human beings but with some kind of manipulable biological model. "You used her as a test subject," I said in my statement. "But you overlooked one thing: human will cannot be silenced forever." As soon as he finished speaking, someone in the audience stood up. It was Erin Walker. She was thin, but her eyes were determined. "We are not doing research," she said quietly, but everyone in the room could hear. "We are creating silent slaves." Her testimony brought a deathly silence to the courtroom. She said that at the time she was just a newly graduated researcher and mistakenly thought she was participating in the development of a cutting-edge technology for post-traumatic memory repair, until one day she accidentally broke into the underground laboratory and saw Rebecca's appearance, like a ghost trapped in time, constantly replaying the memory of that day. "We were told she was a lost cause," Erin said, "but we all knew she wasn't. She was evidence." The media swarmed the scene. The next morning, the news headlines were overwhelming. "The Jacaranda girl is reborn. I am not a ghost, nor a mistake. I am the evidence." In the photo, Rebecca is sitting in a wheelchair, with sunlight shining through the window onto her face. Her eyes were no longer empty, but instead contained a calmness that came from having experienced suffering. The camera slowly zoomed in and stopped on her wrist. There was a brand new silver cufflink with 2 letters engraved on it. Edward Carter. This is not a commemoration, but a judgment. And in the police interrogation room, I was facing Malcolm. He remained silent, as if all this had nothing to do with him. But I knew he was waiting for a flaw. So I spread out the experimental log from that year in front of him and pointed to the most eye-catching sentence on one page. If you can't control it, eliminate it completely. I looked at him and said calmly, "You underestimate human will." At that moment, his eyes finally changed. It was like the first time I really saw what I had done. He slowly raised his head. The corners of his mouth moved, but he didn't speak. But he knew it was all over. When I got back to the office, I received a message from Sean. He said he has submitted a transfer application and is preparing to enter the witness protection program to assist in solving other cases. I didn't ask him where exactly he was going or how long he would stay, but I can guess that he wants to do more than just atone for his sins. That is inheritance. It's also a farewell. As night falls, the streets of Melbourne gradually become quiet. I stood at the office window, looking at the city lights in the distance. Some truths may be late, but they are never absent. This time we made it a step faster. I stood in the witness box and watched Sean walk into the police station the day after the hearing. He was wearing a jacket that had been washed to a pale color. His shoulders were straight and his eyes were calm. Compared to the young man who ran away due to guilt 20 years ago, he is no longer the boy who was protected in the shadow by his father. "I would like to formally submit a transfer application," he said to the front desk, his voice not loud but clear and powerful. "I am willing to enter the witness protection program to assist in solving other cases." The receptionist was stunned for a moment and quickly filled out the form. I watched him fill it out silently until he turned and walked towards me. "My dad once said that the police became police officers to protect people," he said. His eyes fell steadily on my face. "I understand now that sometimes what we need to protect is not people, but the truth itself." I didn't say anything, just nodded slightly. "Thank you for choosing to stand on its side," I said. He smiled, and his smile showed fatigue and relief. After that day, I never saw him again. After the closing hearing, I drove to the Jacaranda Grove alone. The autumn sunshine in Melbourne is gentle and cool, and the mottled shadows of the trees fall on the ground like unfinished puzzle pieces. 20 years ago, Rebecca was murdered in a cabin near this woods. Now her name is finally no longer just old news in the newspapers, nor is it an unattended number in the late-night files. I placed a bouquet of white roses under the tree. The petals were pure white, just like her youth that had never been tainted by the dust. "I heard your voices," I whispered. The wind blew from afar, brushing through the branches and leaves in the forest, making a slight rustling sound. At that moment I seemed to really hear the echo. Rebecca, Irene, Arthur, and those victims and witnesses who have remained silent for many years. Their memories have never really disappeared. It's just hidden too deeply. And someone needs to listen, believe, and persist. And now we have done it. I stood up, brushed the fallen leaves off my knees, and turned to leave. The sunlight shines through the branches and leaves onto my shoulders, warm but not scorching, like some kind of response. An echo that has been dormant for many years finally returns to peace at this moment. This time, we made it a step faster. That's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. Have a good sleep. Good night, dear wanderer.